They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Mine was served at my sister's wedding with champagne and a $100 million price tag. I'll never forget that moment. There I was, Renee Steele, CEO of a multi-million-dollar architecture firm, searching for my name at my own sister's wedding reception. When I found it, my breath caught. Table assignment, hallway overflow tucked beside the kitchen doors, and trash bins away from the celebration, away from family, away from everything. My sister Samantha appeared in her $1,000 gown, surrounded by her bridesmaids like a queen holding court. She looked at me sitting there alone and smiled that cruel, practiced smile I'd known since childhood. "Oh good, you found your seat," she announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "Trash belongs with trash, don't you think?" The guests laughed. My parents stood silent, and something inside me that had been bending for 30 years finally snapped. I set down my champagne glass with perfect composure and walked toward the exit with my head held high. That's when I heard a voice from my past that made my blood run cold. "Hey, boss." I turned. The groom was staring at me, his face draining of color. Mark Dalton, my former employee. The man who'd betrayed me 5 years ago and nearly destroyed my company. And he'd just married my sister. What happened next would shatter their perfect day, expose secrets that should have stayed buried, and prove that when you try to throw someone away, sometimes they come back to take everything. Stay with me, because this story is about to get very, very interesting. My name is Renee Steele. I'm 38 years old, and I built a $200 million architecture firm from absolutely nothing. But none of that mattered the moment I stepped into my sister's wedding reception and realized exactly where my family thought I belonged. The drive to Solara Estate had taken 2 hours through wine country, past rolling vineyards that glowed golden in the late afternoon sun. I'd practiced what I'd say when I saw them, my parents, my sister Samantha, all the relatives I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. I'd rehearsed a polite smile, prepared neutral small talk, told myself I could handle 3 hours at a wedding and then disappear back into my life in Chicago. I'd been wrong about a lot of things in my 38 years, but I'd never been more wrong than thinking this day would go smoothly. I walked into the venue wearing a simple Armani sheath dress in charcoal gray, elegant without being flashy expensive without screaming it. The kind of dress that whispered success rather than shouted it. My hair was pulled back in a low chignon, my jewelry minimal. I'd learned years ago that understated confidence was the best armor. But the moment I crossed the threshold into that opulent reception space, I felt every eye turn toward me with the same expression surprise that I'd actually shown up. The whispers started immediately. Aunt Carol leaned toward her husband, her hand cupped around her mouth like she was protecting state secrets. Cousin Jennifer actually pulled out her phone, probably texting someone that Renee's here. Uncle Tom gave me an awkward nod before quickly looking away, suddenly fascinated by the ice sculpture of intertwined swans near the bar. Nobody approached me. Nobody said hello. It was like I was a ghost they could see but refused to acknowledge. I made my way to the seating chart displayed on an enormous gilded easel wrapped in cream roses and trailing ivy. The escort cards were arranged alphabetically in neat rows, each one hand-calligraphed on thick cardstock. I found the S section. Schultz, Stanley, Steinberg, Stevens. No Steele. I checked again, slower this time, my finger tracing each name. My chest tightened. Had they forgotten to include me? Had the invitation been some kind of cruel joke? Then I saw it tucked at the very bottom, almost hidden behind the easel leg. Renee Steele, hallway, overflow table 1. They'd misspelled both my first and last name. The second E in Renee gone. The E at the end of Steele vanished. Like they'd tried to erase me even on paper. I picked up the card with numb fingers and followed the small arrow pointing toward a side corridor. The main ballroom was a fantasy of crystal chandeliers, candlelight, and cascading floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. String quartet music floated through the air. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits laughed and posed for photos, champagne glasses catching the light like liquid gold. My table was 30 feet down a utilitarian hallway with fluorescent strip lighting that buzzed faintly overhead. The contrast was so stark it was almost comedic. On one side of an archway, elegance and celebration. On the other, harsh light beige walls and the smell of industrial kitchen cleaner. My assigned table was positioned directly across from the service entrance where catering staff rushed back and forth with trays. Next to it sat 3 large trash bins with black plastic bags hanging over the sides. 2 people were already seated. A young man in an ill-fitting suit who looked barely 20 sat hunched over his phone, clearly uncomfortable. Across from him, an elderly woman I vaguely recognized as someone's distant cousin picked at her cuticles, her expression resigned. The table had a cheap polyester tablecloth, not the silk damask used inside, and a wilted centerpiece that looked like it had been recycled from another event. My place setting had a water-spotted wine glass and a napkin with a visible stain near the corner. I sat down carefully, arranging the stained napkin across my lap with hands that trembled despite my best efforts. This was it. This was what my family thought of me. Not even worth a seat in the actual reception. Not worth the expense of a decent centerpiece or clean linens. I was overflow. An afterthought. Trash tucked away where the important guests wouldn't have to look at it. You deserve better than this, honey. I looked up to find an elderly black woman in a venue staff uniform standing beside my chair. She had to be in her late 60s or early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that comes from witnessing both beauty and cruelty for decades. She held a champagne flute filled with real champagne. I could tell by the fine bubbles and golden color, not the cheap Prosecco I'd seen other overflow guests receiving. "I've worked 50 weddings here," she continued, setting the glass in front of me with a gentle smile. "And I know cruelty when I see it." Her name tag read May. Something about her kindness broke through the careful composure I'd maintained since arriving. My eyes burned with tears I refused to let fall. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice catching. May's weathered hand came to rest briefly on my shoulder, warm and solid and real. "Stay strong," she said quietly. Then she disappeared back through the service entrance, leaving me alone with the champagne and the weight of my family's rejection. I sat there in that fluorescent-lit hallway, listening to the laughter and music filtering in from the ballroom, feeling more alone than I'd felt in years. The young man across from me kept checking his watch. The distant cousin had given up on her cuticles and was now staring blankly at the wall. We were the forgotten people. The ones who didn't matter enough to get real seats. That's when I heard the click of heels on marble growing louder, more deliberate. I looked up to see my sister Samantha sweeping down the hallway in her elaborate wedding gown, a confection of ivory silk lace and beading that probably cost $40,000. Her bridesmaids flanked her like ladies-in-waiting, all of them glowing with champagne and self-satisfaction. Samantha stopped when she saw me, her perfectly made-up face arranging itself into an expression of exaggerated surprise. "Oh my God, Renee, you actually came!" Her voice was loud, designed to carry to attract attention. Several guests from the main ballroom turned to look. "I told Mark we should have put you at the kids' table, at least they're inside, but Mom said that would be too obvious." Laughter rippled through the growing crowd of onlookers. Someone pulled out their phone. I could see the camera app open recording. Samantha leaned down, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that everyone could still hear perfectly. "But I guess trash belongs with trash, right?" She smiled, sweet as poisoned honey, and straightened up, clearly pleased with herself. I looked past her to where my parents stood at the edge of the crowd. My father's face was carefully blank. My mother adjusted her pearl necklace and looked away. Neither of them said a word. Neither of them moved to defend me. Their silence was louder than Samantha's cruelty, more devastating than being seated by the garbage bins. Something inside me that had been bending under the weight of their rejection for 30 years finally snapped clean. I set down my champagne glass with perfect precision. I stood slowly smoothing my dress with steady hands. And I looked at Samantha, really looked at her with the kind of pity you reserve for someone who's already destroyed but doesn't know it yet. "Thank you for the reminder," I said quietly, "of why I left." Then I turned to my parents. And thank you for showing me once again exactly who you are. I walked past them all, head high shoulders, back heels, clicking with purpose on the marble floor. The crowd parted. I was almost to the exit, almost free, when a voice rang out behind me that stopped me cold. Hey, boss? I turned slowly, my heart suddenly pounding. Mark Dalton stood frozen in the ballroom entrance champagne glass, halfway to his lips, his face draining of all color. The groom, my sister's brand new husband, and the man who'd nearly destroyed my company 5 years ago. The world seemed to slow down as Mark Dalton stared at me from across the ballroom, his champagne glass trembling in his hand. I watched the exact moment recognition hit him. His eyes widened, his jaw went slack, and the color drained from his face like someone had opened a valve. He set down his glass so quickly it sloshed onto the pristine white tablecloth, and then he was moving, pushing past his groomsmen, weaving through the crowd of confused guests with the desperation of a man who'd just seen a ghost he thought he'd buried years ago. Ms. Steele. His voice cracked on my name. Renee Steele. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note. Conversations died. Every single person in that ballroom turned to watch this bizarre scene unfold. I stood perfectly still near the exit, my hand still on the doorframe, watching him stumble toward me like a man walking to his own execution. I didn't know. Mark stammered, his hands outstretched in some useless gesture of appeasement or explanation. I swear to God, I never made the connection. Samantha never told me, she never mentioned that her sister's full name was Renee Steele. Not the Renee Steele. I let the silence stretch, watching him squirm. Behind him, Samantha had frozen in her elaborate wedding gown, her expression shifting from confusion to something that looked almost like fear. My mother's hand had flown to her throat. My father had gone pale. The Renee Steele, I repeated softly, my voice carrying in the absolute silence. CEO of Steel Dynamics, the woman you worked under 5 years ago on the Riverside Tower project. Does that ring a bell, Mark? He flinched like I'd slapped him. I can explain. Can you? I turned to address the room now, not just Mark. My voice was ice cold, each word precise and deliberate. 5 years ago, Mark Dalton worked as a junior project manager on a $100 million contract that my company was bidding for. It was the biggest deal we'd ever pursued. Make or break for Steel Dynamics. Guests were pulling out their phones now, some recording, others frantically typing. I could see the realization dawning on faces throughout the crowd. This wasn't just family drama. This was business scandal, the kind that made headlines. I trusted Mark with preliminary designs. I continued, my eyes never leaving his face. Architectural renderings, cost analyses, sustainability reports. Everything we'd spent 18 months developing. Proprietary information worth millions. Mark's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Samantha had pushed through the crowd now, grabbing his arm, whispering urgently in his ear, but he seemed unable to move or respond. Those designs were leaked to our competitor Haverton Group 3 days before the final bid. I paused, letting that sink in. Haverton submitted a proposal that was almost identical to ours, but undercut our price by exactly enough to win the contract. I lost that deal. I nearly lost my company. I spent the next 2 years rebuilding from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks, remortgaging everything I owned just to keep my employees paid. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Someone near the back whispered, "Oh my God." An older woman in a purple dress had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "I could never prove who leaked those files," I said, my voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "The digital forensics were inconclusive. No smoking gun. But I always had my suspicions about who was responsible." Mark's face had gone from pale to gray. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. The truth was written all over him in his trembling hands, his panicked eyes, the way he couldn't meet my gaze. Everyone in that room could see it. He was guilty, and he knew I knew, and now 300 wedding guests knew too. What made the betrayal particularly devastating? I said, Taking one step back toward the room was how the files were accessed. They weren't hacked from our company servers. They were copied from my personal laptop. I paused, letting my eyes sweep across my family members standing in the crowd. The laptop I'd brought with me to a family dinner at my parents' house that same weekend. I was trying to meet a deadline, working late at their kitchen table after everyone had gone to bed. My gaze landed on Samantha, who had gone absolutely rigid beside her new husband. Her fingers dug into Mark's arm so hard I could see her knuckles turning white. "Only family was there that weekend," I said softly. "Only family knew my password. Only family had access to that laptop while I slept." The implication hung in the air like smoke. I didn't spell it out. I didn't need to. Every person in that room was doing the math, connecting the dots between Mark Dalton and my sister Samantha, between a stolen contract and a wedding 5 years later. Samantha's face had transformed from confusion to something approaching horror. That's not," she sputtered, but the words died in her throat as guests began murmuring, heads turning toward her phones, still recording every moment of this unraveling. My mother took a step forward, her voice sharp with desperation. "Renee, this is inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" I laughed a sound without humor. "You seat me next to the garbage and let your daughter mock me in front of 300 people, but I'm being inappropriate." I looked at Mark one last time at his ashen face and trembling hands at my sister beside him, in her $40,000 dress at my parents who'd spent 38 years choosing her over me in every way that mattered. "Congratulations on your marriage," I said quietly. "I hope you'll be very happy together." Then I turned and walked out into the warm evening air, leaving behind the chaos, the whispers, the shocked faces, and the flash of camera phones capturing the moment a perfect wedding imploded. Mark didn't know he'd just married his worst mistake, but he was about to learn. I drove away from Solara Estate with my hands steady on the wheel, watching the vineyard fade in my rearview mirror, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph exactly, but a strange sense of completion. The girl who'd learned to stay silent had finally spoken. But that girl, the one who learned silence was survival, had been shaped long before tonight's confrontation. I was 10 years old the first time I understood that excellence wouldn't save me. It was a Tuesday in October, and I'd brought home my report card with 6 perfect A's printed in neat rows, along with a handwritten note from Mrs. Patterson, my science teacher, praising my solar system project. I'd spent 3 weeks building a scale model with papier-mâché planets, researching orbital distances, writing a 10-page report on gravitational forces. I was so proud I practically floated through the front door. My mother was in the kitchen with Samantha, who was 7 at the time, holding a script for her school's production of The Wizard of Oz. Samantha had been cast as Munchkin number 3, a role with exactly 2 lines, and my mother was treating it like she'd landed the lead on Broadway. "Say it with more enthusiasm, sweetheart." My mother coached her hands on Samantha's shoulders. "Remember, you're welcoming Dorothy to a magical land." I stood in the doorway, report card clutched in my hands, waiting for a break in their rehearsal. When my mother finally looked up, I held out the paper like an offering. "Mom, look, straight A's. And Mrs. Patterson said my project was the best she's seen in 15 years of teaching." My mother took the report card, glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds, and handed it back with a distracted smile. "That's nice, dear. Very good." Then she turned back to Samantha. "Now let's try that second line again. Really project your voice this way." I stood there for another moment, waiting for more, for pride, for excitement, for any indication that what I'd accomplished mattered. When nothing came, I walked to the refrigerator and stuck the report card under a magnet next to Samantha's crayon drawing of a rainbow. That evening, my father came home and announced he was taking Samantha out for ice cream to celebrate her trying her best in math. She'd gotten a C+. I watched them leave together, Samantha skipping and holding his hand, while I sat at the kitchen table with my untouched homework and my perfect grades that nobody cared about. The pattern repeated itself so many times, I lost count. My piano recital where I performed Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat. Major apiece my teacher said was advanced for my age was attended by my parents with polite, restrained applause. 6 months later. Samantha's first recital featured an off-key, hesitant rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and my mother stood up mid-performance, beaming and recording on her camcorder, leading the room in a standing ovation. Afterward, my father presented Samantha with a bouquet of roses. I'd received a nod and a "well done" after my Chopin. By the time I was 12, I understood the fundamental truth of my family. Samantha was the sun, and I was expected to be grateful for whatever reflected light reached me. She was objectively the easier daughter, bubbly, where I was reserved, social, where I was selective, conventionally pretty, with her blonde curls and dimpled smile, while I was all dark hair and serious eyes. At family gatherings, relatives would cluster around Samantha, pinching her cheeks, asking about her friends and her latest school crush. They'd approach me with forced cheerfulness and awkward questions. "Still so serious, Renee? You should smile more, sweetheart. Boys like girls who smile." My mother would explain me to neighbors and friends like I was a puzzle she'd never quite solved. "Samantha takes after me, warm and loving, always thinking of others. Renee is more like her grandfather, all business and numbers, very independent." She never said it cruelly. She said it like she was describing the weather, a simple fact of nature. But what I heard was, "You're the wrong kind of daughter. You're not what we wanted." My father was never cruel to me, but his absence hurt just as much as my mother's indifference. He existed in a state of perpetual distraction, always on a work call or buried in paperwork or too tired to engage. When I won the state math competition in 8th grade, beating out students 2 years older, I rushed home bursting to tell him. He was on the phone in his study, and he held up one finger. "Wait." I waited 20 minutes. When he finally hung up, I started to explain my achievement, but his phone rang again and he answered it with an apologetic shrug. At 16, when Samantha got a brand new Honda Civic with a bow on top for her birthday, I asked my father why I'd received a used bike 2 years earlier for the same milestone. He sighed, not even looking up from his newspaper. "Your mother handles these things, honey. You know how she is." That was his answer for everything your mother handles. Your mother decided, talk to your mother. He never contradicted her favoritism, never questioned why one daughter received everything while the other received leftovers. His silence taught me that love was conditional, that being exceptional wasn't enough, and that even the people who should protect you would choose not to see your pain if it made their lives easier. So I stopped speaking up. Silence became my first language and my armor. I learned to survive in silence, to expect nothing, and feel grateful for scraps. But there was one moment when I believed things might be different, one achievement so extraordinary that surely it would make them see me. I was 17 when the acceptance letter arrived from MIT, and I was naive enough to think it would change everything. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, embossed with the MIT seal. My hands shook as I opened it at the kitchen table, reading the words that would alter the trajectory of my entire life. Full academic scholarship to the School of Architecture and Planning. Top 2% of applicants nationwide. They wanted me. One of the most prestigious universities in the world had looked at my grades, my portfolio, my essays, and decided I was worth investing in. I ran to find my parents, clutching the letter like it was made of gold. They were in the living room, my mother reading a magazine, my father watching the evening news. "I got in," I said breathlessly. "MIT, full academic scholarship. They're covering tuition completely." My mother's face did something strange. Her smile tightened at the edges and her eyes went flat. She took the letter from my hands, read it in silence, then handed it back without a word. My father glanced at it briefly and offered a distracted, "That's good, honey," before turning back to the television. The scholarship covered tuition, but not housing meal plans, books, or materials. The financial aid office estimated I'd need roughly $15,000 per year for living expenses. It was an enormous sum, but I'd been preparing for this. Since I was 14 years old, I'd been babysitting every weekend, tutoring kids in math and science after school, and spending summers working at a local architectural drafting firm where I learned CAD software and filed blueprints for $8 an hour. Every single penny went into a joint savings account with my mother as the primary holder, a requirement because I was a minor and couldn't open an account alone. By graduation, I had $18,000 saved. Enough for my first year with $3,000 left over for emergencies. I'd earned every cent through early mornings and late nights, through missing parties and social events, through choosing work over everything else. That money represented 3 years of sacrifice, and it was mine. 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave for Boston, I went to the bank to withdraw the funds and open my own account now that I was 18. The teller typed on her computer, frowned, typed again, then looked up at me with apologetic eyes. "I'm sorry, but this account shows a balance of $67.32. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "That's impossible. There should be over 18,000. Check again." She checked. The money was gone. Withdrawn in 3 large transactions over the past month, all authorized by the primary account holder. My mother. I drove home in a daze, my hands numb on the steering wheel, a roaring sound in my ears that might have been rage or panic or both. I found my mother in the garden pruning roses with small silver scissors, humming softly to herself. "Where's my money?" My voice came out steady cold. She didn't even stop pruning. "Samantha got accepted to the New York School of Visual Arts. It's a wonderful program, very competitive. The tuition is $40,000 per year, and of course she won't qualify for financial aid because of your father's income bracket. We needed to help her get started." I stared at her, waiting for the apology, the acknowledgement, anything that showed she understood what she'd done. Nothing came. "That was my money," I said, my voice shaking now. "I earned it. 3 years of work. You stole from me." Her expression hardened. "Family helps family, Renee. Besides, you received that scholarship, you'll be fine. Samantha needs our support more than you do. She's not as self-sufficient as you are." Self-sufficient? I nearly choked on the word. "I've been self-sufficient because I've had no choice. You've never helped me with anything." My mother set down her pruning scissors and looked at me with something almost like pity. "You've always been so dramatic. Samantha is pursuing her dreams and we're her parents. It's our job to support her. You should be happy for your sister instead of being selfish." I found my father in his study, showed him the empty bank statement, explained what had happened. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Your mother already decided," he mumbled, shuffling papers on his desk. "What's done is done. Maybe you can get a student loan or something." "She stole $18,000 from me." I said each word deliberate. "I'm going to file a police report for account fraud." That's when my mother appeared in the doorway, her face cold and composed. "The bank won't help you. I was the primary account holder. Legally, I had every right to use those funds as I saw fit. You were a minor when the account was opened and the money was technically under my control." I felt something break inside my chest, something fundamental and irreparable. Then she delivered the final blow, her voice casual, almost kind. "Honestly, Renee, MIT might be too much pressure for you anyway. I called the admissions office to ask about their requirements. Apparently, your scholarship requires maintaining a 3.8 GPA. That's unrealistic for anyone, especially in architecture. You're setting yourself up for failure and disappointment. Maybe community college would be a better fit to start." The scholarship required a 3.0. I'd read the terms 100 times. She was lying to my face, trying to make me doubt myself, trying to convince me I wasn't capable, so I'd give up and stay small and never outshine the golden child who needed $40,000 of my money to pursue a mediocre art degree. That night, I packed a single suitcase with clothes, my laptop, and my acceptance letter. I left behind photo albums, childhood books, everything that tied me to that house. I was 18 years old with $67 to my name and a full scholarship to a school I could no longer afford to attend. I had no plan, no safety net, and no family to fall back on. But I had clarity. I finally understood that my family would sabotage me, steal from me, lie to me, and sleep soundly afterward. They would sacrifice me over and over again to keep Samantha comfortable and adored. I learned the hardest truth that night: betrayal hurts most when it wears your mother's voice. I left home with $67 a suitcase, and the kind of anger that either destroys you or forges you into something unbreakable. I chose the latter, though there were nights I wasn't sure I'd survive the choosing. Mrs. Hendricks, my high school calculus teacher, was the only person I told about MIT and what my mother had done. She listened without interrupting, then wrote me a check for $200 from her own account. "Pay me back when you're successful," she said. "And Renee, you will be successful. Don't let them take that from you too." I cried in her classroom after school that day, the only tears I allowed myself for months. I deferred MIT for 1 year and took a Greyhound bus to Chicago with $367 total and no plan beyond survival. I found a dingy studio apartment in a neighborhood where gunshots punctuated the night, paid first month's rent, and got to work. Within a week, I had 3 jobs. The breakfast shift at Mel's Diner started at 5 in the morning. I served coffee and eggs to construction workers and nurses coming off night shifts, pocketing tips that smelled like bacon grease and exhaustion. At 9, I'd run 6 blocks to Hartman & Associates, a small architecture firm that needed a receptionist. I answered phones, filed blueprints, scheduled client meetings, and made myself invisible and indispensable. From 10 at night until 2 in the morning, I cleaned office buildings downtown with a crew of immigrant women who spoke little English but taught me everything about efficiency and pride in work that others looked down on. I slept from 3 to 4:30 in the morning, showered in cold water because the hot was broken, and started again. I ate ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, sometimes the same meal 3 times a day. I lost 15 pounds in 2 months. I didn't care. At Hartman & Associates, I arrived 30 minutes early each day to read through project files left on desks, absorbing information about zoning codes, client contracts, and design specifications. I stayed late after my shift ended, teaching myself advanced CAD software on the office computers, watching tutorial videos with the sound muted so no one would know I was still there. The senior architects, all men in their 40s and 50s, barely acknowledged my existence beyond asking me to make copies or fetch coffee. "Sweetheart, can you run this down to the print shop?" "Honey, we need more coffee in the conference room." I smiled, said yes, and memorized everything they discussed when they thought I wasn't listening. I learned how they negotiated with contractors, how they managed client expectations, how they structured bids for competitive projects. I learned that architecture was only partly about design. The rest was psychology, money, and knowing how to sell a vision to people who couldn't see it yet. I absorbed building codes like other people absorbed novels. I studied their mistakes and their triumphs. I made myself into a student of the industry while they saw only a receptionist who brought them coffee. 8 months into this brutal routine, when I was so tired I sometimes fell asleep standing up on the train, I received a letter from a law office I didn't recognize. Inside was a notification that my grandfather, my father's father, a man I'd met only a handful of times before my parents cut him off over some inheritance dispute, had passed away. He'd left me $50,000. The letter from the lawyer included a handwritten note on yellowed paper, my grandfather's shaky script filling the page. "Renee, your father told me what your mother did with your college money. He called me crying, ashamed, but too weak to fix it. I'm ashamed of them both. This is what I should have given you for your high school graduation. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to stay in your life. Build something they can't ignore. Build something that's entirely yours. Don't let them steal your dreams twice. Make them choke on their regret. Love, Grandpa Robert." I sat on the floor of my terrible apartment and cried for the first time since leaving home, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and wounded. Someone had seen me. Someone had believed I was worth investing in. Someone had loved me enough to give me a second chance. That money changed everything. I enrolled at MIT the following fall, worked part-time throughout school, and graduated with honors and zero debt. At 25, I launched Steel Dynamics with a $15,000 loan and a vision that the industry thought was naive, sustainable architecture for mid-sized cities, not just wealthy coastal elites. My first project was a community center in Detroit, a city everyone had written off as dead. I designed a building that used solar panels, rainwater collection, and recycled materials, coming in 30% under budget, and creating a model that other cities started requesting. By 30, I was managing $50 million in active projects. By 35, my personal net worth hit $200 million. And Forbes featured me in their 40 Under 40 issue with the headline, "The Iron Lady of Green Architecture." I hated that nickname at first. It made me sound cold, unfeeling, but I learned to wield it like armor. If they wanted to see me as iron, I'd be unbreakable. Through all of it, the late nights, the difficult clients, the sexist investors who questioned whether a woman could run a construction company, the moments of doubt when I wondered if my mother had been right about me failing, I never once contacted my family. And they never contacted me either. Not when I was featured in Architectural Digest. Not when I won the National Design Award. Not when the Chicago Tribune ran a profile about my rise from nothing. Silence flowed both directions, and I told myself I preferred it that way. Until the wedding invitation arrived 15 years later, cream-colored and embossed with my name spelled wrong and everything I'd built rendered invisible. I built an empire from nothing, and they never even said congratulations. 15 years of silence can feel like safety until something pierces through it and reminds you that wounds don't heal just because you stop looking at them. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring, placed on my desk by my assistant Jennifer, who'd recognized the surname and thought I should see it personally rather than having it sorted with the rest of my mail. The cardstock was expensive cream-colored with gold embossing that caught the light from my floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. My name was printed in elaborate script across the front, Renee Steele. No second E in Renee. No E at the end of Steele. Even in invitation form, they couldn't get me right. Inside the invitation itself was a study in excess silk ribbon tissue paper, overlay calligraphy that probably cost $5 per letter. Samantha Rose Steele and Mark Andrew Dalton request the pleasure of your company at their wedding celebration. The date was 6 weeks away. Solara Estate Vineyard. Black tie optional. A handwritten note on monogrammed stationery was tucked inside Samantha's looping handwriting, instantly recognizable despite the years. Renee, I know we haven't spoken in years, but you're still my sister. I hope you can make it this time. It would mean everything to Mom and Dad. Love, Samantha. The "this time" made my jaw clench. This time as if I'd been the one refusing contact. As if I'd been the one who chose estrangement over acknowledging what they'd done. I'd declined her engagement party invitation 8 months ago, returned with no note. I'd ignored the bridal shower invitation before that. I hadn't attended a family Thanksgiving or Christmas in 12 years, not since the first one after I'd launched Steel Dynamics, when my mother spent the entire meal talking about Samantha's latest art show and asking me to pass the potatoes without ever once asking about my business. I set the invitation aside and tried to focus on work. I had a presentation for the Detroit City Council in 2 days, a project worth $30 million that would revitalize an entire neighborhood. That mattered. That was real. A wedding invitation from people who'd erased me long before I left was just paper and manipulation. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. I recognized my mother's angular handwriting, immediately my name and address written with the aggressive precision she brought to everything. The note inside was brief, typed on her personal stationery, no warm greeting or closing. Samantha is getting married. This is a family event. Don't make this about you again. Your sister has worked very hard to build a relationship with a good man. The least you can do is show up and be happy for her. Whatever grievances you're holding on to, it's time to let them go. We're not getting any younger. Don't make this about you again. The again referred to my MIT graduation, an event I hadn't invited them to, because I knew they wouldn't come, wouldn't care, would find some way to center Samantha, even on a day that should have been mine. My mother had told relatives I'd deliberately excluded them, that I'd sent an invitation to the wrong address out of spite. It was easier to make me the villain than to admit they'd never asked for the details, never reached out, never acknowledged what should have been the proudest moment of my academic life. I held both letters in my hands that evening, standing in my penthouse apartment with its custom furniture and original artwork, and perfect, pristine emptiness. No family photos on the walls, no sentimental objects on shelves. I'd built a life that was entirely mine, untouched by their toxicity. And yet here I was, 38 years old, and still holding my breath every time their names appeared in my peripheral vision. I almost threw both invitations away. I drafted a decline in my head, something brief and professional that would close the door permanently. But that night, unable to sleep, I found myself still thinking about that cream-colored cardstock, about the casual cruelty of, "Don't make this about you," about the fact that after everything, some part of me still wanted them to see who I'd become. At 2 a.m, I called Dr. Patricia Chen, my therapist, and left a voicemail. She called back the next day during my lunch hour, and I explained the situation while pacing my office 43 floors above the city I'd conquered. "What would closure look like for you?" Dr. Chen asked, her voice calm and measured. I didn't have an answer. I'd spent 15 years thinking closure meant never seeing them again, but the knot in my chest suggested otherwise. "Maybe," Dr. Chen said carefully, "it's not about them forgiving you or you forgiving them. Maybe it's about you witnessing who they are now and releasing the fantasy of who you needed them to be. You've built an extraordinary life, Renee, but you're still carrying their voices in your head. Maybe it's time to see them as they actually are, small, flawed human, and let go of the power you've given them." I sat with that for 2 days. Then, on a Thursday evening, I opened my laptop and navigated to the RSVP website embedded in the invitation. My cursor hovered over the decline button for a long moment. But Dr. Chen was right. I needed to see them not for reconciliation but for release. I needed to walk into that room as the woman I'd become, let them see what they'd thrown away, and then walk back out into my life without their shadows following me. I clicked accept. 1 guest, no +1. I'd go alone just as I'd done everything else. I thought I was going to a wedding. I was walking into a reckoning. The drive to Solara Estate took me through 2 hours of wine country that belonged in a tourism brochure, endless rows of grapevines climbing gentle hills, late afternoon sunlight turning everything amber and gold. I'd rented a sleek black sedan for the occasion, something understated but expensive, and I drove with the windows down, trying to convince myself that this was just another business obligation. Show up, be seen, leave. Simple. Nothing about that day would be simple. Solara Estate announced itself with a stone entrance gate and a winding private drive lined with manicured hedges. The main building was a restored 19th-century villa, all honey-colored stone and arched windows surrounded by terraced gardens that descended toward acres of vineyards. Valet attendants in crisp white shirts directed a parade of luxury vehicles. Mercedes BMWs, a Bentley that probably cost more than my first office lease. I handed over my keys and walked toward the entrance, my Armani sheath dress suddenly feeling too plain, too serious. Too much like armor I wasn't sure would hold. The venue screamed wealth in that particular way that only old money or people desperately pretending to be old money could achieve. A string quartet played Vivaldi under a pergola draped in white roses and trailing jasmine. The champagne tower near the entrance was constructed from at least 200 crystal flutes, each one catching light like a tiny prism. I recognized the bottles being poured Veuve Clicquot La Grande Dame, roughly $200 retail. The floral arrangements alone probably cost $20,000, massive cascading displays of imported roses, peonies, and orchids in shades of blush and cream. I did the mental math automatically, a habit from years of project budgeting. This wedding was costing at least $200,000, possibly closer to $300,000 once you factored in the venue rental catering for what looked like 300 guests, the photographer I'd spotted with professional equipment that cost more than a car, and the 5-tier wedding cake I could see being assembled in a side room. My father had been a mid-level insurance manager before retirement, living on a modest pension. My mother had never worked outside the home. There was no family money, no inheritance that I knew of. Either Samantha's art career had somehow become wildly successful, which seemed impossible given the mediocre gallery showings I'd seen mentioned on her social media, or someone else was financing this performance. The guests matched the venue's opulence. Women glided past in Valentino and Oscar de la Renta diamonds glittering at their throats and wrists. Men in custom suits discussed summer homes in the Hamptons and recent investments in tech startups. I caught fragments of conversation about yacht clubs and private schools, European vacations, and art acquisitions. These were Samantha's people now, apparently. I wondered how many of them knew that her sister had built a $200 million company, or if I existed at all in the carefully curated narrative of her life. I spotted my mother first holding court near the rose-covered arbor where the ceremony would take place. She wore an elaborate mother-of-the-bride gown in champagne silk, her hair professionally styled in complicated twists, her makeup flawless. Our eyes met across the garden, and I watched something flicker across her face. Surprise, maybe, or displeasure. It was hard to tell with her. She approached with the rigid posture of someone fulfilling an obligation. "Oh, you came," not "I'm so glad you're here," or "You look lovely," or even "Thank you for making the trip." Just acknowledgement, flat and cool, like I was a delivery she'd been expecting but wasn't particularly pleased to receive. "I RSVP'd yes," I said, keeping my voice even. "Did you think I wouldn't come?" She waved a hand dismissively, already scanning the crowd for someone more important to greet. "Samantha will be pleased. You know how she is about appearances." Then she drifted away without another word pulled into conversation, with a woman wearing enough jewelry to fund a small country's GDP. My father materialized a moment later, looking uncomfortable in his tuxedo, tugging at his bow tie like it was strangling him. "Renee, honey, good to see you." He pulled me into an awkward side hug, his arm barely touching my shoulders, his attention already elsewhere. Before I could respond, a well-dressed woman I didn't recognize appeared at his elbow. Samantha's future mother-in-law, based on her proprietary grip on his arm, and he was pulled away mid-greeting, mumbling apologies as he disappeared into the crowd. I stood alone in that beautiful garden, watching relatives I hadn't seen in over a decade notice me whisper to each other, and then deliberately turn away. Aunt Carol pointed me out to her daughter, their heads bent together in conspiratorial conversation. Cousin Michael looked directly at me, recognition clear on his face, then made an elaborate show of checking his phone and walking in the opposite direction. Uncle Tom approached with forced cheerfulness, clearly having been sent over by someone to fulfill a social obligation. "Renee, been a long time. You still in the, construction business?" Construction? My company had been featured in Architectural Digest 3 times. I'd won the National Design Award. The Chicago Tribune had called me a visionary. And to my uncle, I was still in construction, like I was pouring concrete on job sites instead of designing buildings that would stand for generations. "Architecture," I corrected gently. "I run an architecture firm, Steel Dynamics." He nodded blankly, clearly having never heard of it, already looking over my shoulder for an escape route. That's great. Well, good to see you. Better find my seat." He fled before I could say anything else. None of them knew anything about my life. Not one of them had Googled my name, read an article, asked a single question. I'd become one of the most successful architects in the Midwest, and to my family, I was a vague memory associated with construction and awkward silence. I made my way toward the seating chart, needing to know where I'd been placed, dreading the answer. That's when I encountered May, an elderly woman in a simple service uniform restocking napkins at the bar. She looked at me with eyes that were sharp and kind in equal measure, taking in my dress, my careful posture, the way I held myself apart from everyone else. "Table assignments are inside, dear," she said, her voice low and warm. "Though if I were you, I'd brace yourself." Something in her tone made me stop. Why would I need to brace myself? May's smile was sad and knowing. I've been working events for 40 years. You learn to read people, read situations. Just be ready, honey. When I found my name at the hallway overflow table, May appeared beside me as if she'd been waiting. She held out that glass of real champagne, not the cheaper alternative being served to other overflow guests, and her weathered hand found mine briefly. I know cruelty dressed up as celebration when I see it, she said quietly. Your grandfather would be proud of you. My breath caught in my throat. You knew my grandfather. May's smile deepened, but she didn't answer directly. She just patted my hand with a gentleness that made my eyes burn. Stay strong, honey. Sometimes the trash takes itself out. Then she was gone, disappearing back into the service corridor, leaving me standing there with questions I couldn't ask, and a strange feeling that May knew far more than she was saying. I didn't know what May meant. Not yet. I walked down that fluorescent-lit hallway, with May's cryptic words echoing in my head, turned the corner, and found my assigned seat at a table that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and afterthoughts. The place card confirmed what I already knew in my bones: Renee Steele. Not Renee, not Steele. They'd erased the letters that made my name mine, stripped away the identity I'd built into something recognizable and respected across the industry. This wasn't a typo made by some harried calligrapher. This was deliberate, calculated erasure. I picked up the card, feeling the quality of the cardstock cheaper than the ones I'd seen on tables inside the ballroom. The calligraphy less elegant. The whole thing an obvious afterthought. I set it down and surveyed my place setting. The napkin folded in a sad approximation of the elaborate swan folds I'd glimpsed on the main tables had a visible rust-colored stain near one corner, like someone had spilled wine at a previous event, and the linen service hadn't bothered to replace it. The water glass showed fingerprints and a slight lipstick mark that hadn't been properly washed. The centerpiece was a sorry collection of wilted flowers, roses with browning edges, drooping carnations, baby's breath that had seen better days, clearly leftovers from some other wedding, something they'd pulled from storage rather than waste on the overflow table. Two people were already seated, both looking as uncomfortable as I felt. A young couple, maybe mid-20s, the woman in a department store cocktail dress, the man tugging at a tie that didn't quite match his suit. They glanced up as I approached, and the woman offered an apologetic smile. Hi, I'm Jessica. This is my boyfriend Ryan. We're here as plus ones. Ryan's cousin works with the Groom. We got here a little late because of traffic, and they said all the assigned seats were full, so... She gestured vaguely at the hallway, at the harsh lighting and the proximity to kitchen noise. Not sure why we ended up out here, honestly. Seems kind of weird, right? Even the random late arrivals could see this was the reject table, the place where unwanted guests were stored like forgotten furniture. I sat down carefully, positioning myself, so I could see into the main ballroom, watching the approved guests laugh and toast and bask in the golden glow of chandeliers and celebration. I straightened my spine, arranged the stained napkin across my lap with hands that I willed to stay steady, and made a decision. I would stay for the ceremony because I'd driven 2 hours and RSVP'd yes. I would witness Samantha marry whoever this Mark Dalton was. And then I would leave before dinner, drive back to Chicago, and never respond to another invitation from these people again. This would be closure on my terms. But Samantha had other plans. I heard her before I saw her, that bright, performative laugh that carried across rooms, designed to draw attention and hold it. The click of expensive heels on marble grew louder, more deliberate, accompanied by the rustling of an elaborate gown, and the murmured admiration of her bridesmaids. She was making a show of greeting guests, touring her kingdom like royalty, acknowledging subjects, and I realized with sinking certainty that she was coming this way. She appeared at the entrance to the hallway in a confection of ivory silk and French lace that had probably cost more than most people's cars, her veil trailing behind her like a bridal train in a fairy tale. 5 bridesmaids flanking her in matching blush-pink gowns. Her makeup was flawless, her hair swept into an elaborate updo studded with tiny crystals. She looked like every little girl's dream of a princess bride, and her eyes, when they landed on me sitting at my reject table, glittered with something that definitely wasn't sisterly affection. Renee. Her voice was loud, projected, designed to carry into the main ballroom and draw every eye. "Oh my God, you actually showed up!" Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. I could feel the weight of 300 guests' attention shifting toward the hallway, toward this moment Samantha was orchestrating with the precision of a stage director. Jessica and Ryan beside me went very still, sensing they were about to witness something they hadn't signed up for. Samantha moved closer, her bridesmaids giggling behind their hands like a Greek chorus of cruelty. "I told Mark we should put you at the kids' table. At least they get to sit inside with the real guests, but Mom said that would be too obvious." She paused for the laughter that rippled through the crowd of onlookers gathering in the doorway. Someone pulled out their phone and I saw the camera app open, recording this moment for posterity and social media. My mother and father had materialized in the hallway entrance, drawn by the commotion, their faces carefully arranged into expressions of amused tolerance. Not concern, not embarrassment at their daughter's public cruelty, just passive observation like they were watching a mildly interesting television show. Samantha leaned down, bringing her face close to mine, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow managed to be louder than if she'd shouted. "But, I guess, trash belongs with trash, right?" She delivered the line with a smile sweet and poisonous, like she'd just told a delightful joke we were all in on. Her bridesmaids burst into laughter. More guests crowded the doorway, drawn by the spectacle. Camera phones multiplied little glowing rectangles, capturing my humiliation from every angle. Jessica muttered, "Oh my God," under her breath. Ryan's face had gone red with secondhand embarrassment. For a long moment, I sat there feeling the weight of every eye in that venue, the heat of shame and rage mixing in my chest, threatening to escape as tears or screaming or some other display that would prove I was exactly what they'd always said, too emotional, too sensitive, unable to take a joke. That's what Samantha wanted. That's what they were all waiting for. The breakdown, the scene, the proof that I deserved this treatment. Instead, I stood slowly smoothing my dress with deliberate care. I picked up my champagne glass, the good champagne May had brought me, and took a long, measured sip, letting the bubbles settle on my tongue before I swallowed. Then I set the glass down with perfect precision, the crystal base meeting the table with a soft, definitive click that somehow carried in the absolute silence that had fallen over the crowd. I looked at Samantha, really looked at her, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not hurt. Pity. This woman in her $40,000 dress, surrounded by rented friends and borrowed elegance, still so threatened by my existence that she had to perform this cruelty for an audience. Still so desperate to prove she was better, more valuable, more worthy of love. "Thank you for the reminder," I said quietly, my voice steady and clear, of why I left. Then I turned to face my parents, still standing frozen in that doorway like statues of complicity, their silence once again speaking louder than any words could. "And thank you for showing me once again exactly who you are." I walked past Samantha, past her stunned bridesmaids, past my parents, who finally had the grace to look uncomfortable. I walked through the crowd of guests who parted like water, none of them willing to meet my eyes now that the entertainment was over. My heels clicked on marble with a rhythm that felt like a countdown, each step taking me closer to freedom, to fresh air, to a life where these people held no power over me anymore. I was 3 steps from the exit, my hand already reaching for the ornate brass door handle, when a voice rang out behind me that stopped me cold. "Hey, boss!" The world seemed to freeze. I turned slowly, my heart suddenly pounding against my ribs. Mark's face was white, and my sister's perfect day was about to shatter. Mark Dalton came barreling through the crowd like a man who'd just seen a ghost rise from the grave, his champagne glass tilting dangerously in his hand, liquid sloshing over the rim and spattering onto his pristine tuxedo. His groomsmen turned to watch him with confused expressions, clearly wondering why their friend had abandoned them mid-conversation to chase after a departing guest. But I knew that look on his face. I'd seen it 5 years ago when I'd confronted him about irregularities in our project timeline, when he'd stammered excuses and avoided my eyes before disappearing from my company entirely. "Ms. Steele?" His voice cracked on my name, desperation making it louder than he probably intended. Renee Steele. I stopped with my hand still on the door handle, that brass cool and solid under my palm, and turned slowly to face the man who'd nearly destroyed everything I'd built. Behind him, Samantha's face was transforming from smug satisfaction to confusion, her perfectly made-up features arranging themselves into a question she hadn't yet formed. The crowd that had been so eager to witness my humiliation now pressed closer, sensing something bigger unfolding, their phones emerging from clutches and pockets like a plague of glowing rectangles. Mark reached me, breathing hard, his face pale beneath his wedding day tan. Up close, I could see the panic in his eyes, the way his free hand trembled as he reached toward me in some useless gesture of explanation or appeasement. "I didn't know," he stammered, words tumbling over each other. "I swear to God, I never made the connection. Samantha never told me. She never mentioned that her sister's last name was... I mean, she said you were estranged. She called you Renee, but she never said..." I held up one hand, cutting off his babbling with the kind of authority I'd learned managing construction sites full of men who thought they could talk over me. My voice came out cold, precise. Each word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. "You mean you didn't know that the estranged sister your wife just mocked in front of 300 guests is the CEO of Steel Dynamics?" The room went so quiet I could hear someone's sharp intake of breath, could hear the rustle of Samantha's wedding gown as she moved closer, could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "The woman whose company you worked for 5 years ago." I continued, watching his face drain of what little color remained. "The woman whose $100 million contract you helped sabotage." The string quartet stopped playing mid-note. Someone dropped a champagne glass and it shattered against marble with a sound like breaking promises. The crowd pressed in tighter, and I could see phones being raised, higher angles being adjusted to capture every moment of this implosion. Mark's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Behind him, his groomsmen exchanged confused glances. Samantha had frozen completely, one hand clutched to her bouquet, her face a mask of incomprehension. I turned slightly, addressing the room now, not just Mark. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Power, real power, doesn't shout. It speaks quietly and makes everyone lean in to listen. 5 years ago, Mark Dalton worked under my supervision on the Riverside Tower project. It was the biggest contract my company had ever pursued, a $100 million sustainable development deal that would have established Steel Dynamics as a major player in commercial architecture. I paused, letting that number settle, watching comprehension dawn on faces throughout the crowd. Business people, all of them. They understood exactly what losing a deal that size meant. I trusted Mark with preliminary designs, architectural renderings, engineering specifications, cost analyses. 18 months of work by my entire team, proprietary information worth millions. Mark made a small sound, something between a whimper and a protest, but I kept going. Those designs were leaked to our primary competitor, Haverton Group, 3 days before the final bid submission. They presented a proposal that was nearly identical to ours and undercut our price by exactly the margin needed to win the contract. Gasps rippled through the ballroom like wind through wheat. Someone in the back row had their phone held high, clearly recording every word. An elderly woman near the champagne tower had her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with scandal. "I lost that contract," I said softly. "I nearly lost my company. I spent the next 2 years rebuilding from the ground up, working 100-hour weeks, remortgaging everything I owned just to keep my employees paid and my doors open." Samantha had pushed through the crowd, now grabbing Mark's arm with white-knuckled fingers. "What is she talking about?" Her voice was shrill, panicked. "Mark, what is this?" But Mark couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, at his expensive shoes, at anything except his new wife's face. And that avoidance was more damning than any confession. "I could never prove who stole those files." I continued, my eyes fixed on Mark's downturned face. "The digital forensics were inconclusive. No trail that would hold up in court. But I always had my suspicions about who was responsible." Mark's face confirmed everything. The guilt was written in every line of his expression, in the way he wouldn't look up, in the trembling of his hands. 300 wedding guests could see it as clearly as I could. I took a breath and delivered the final blow, the piece I hadn't planned to share, but that now seemed inevitable necessary. What made the theft particularly devastating was how the files were accessed. They weren't hacked from our company servers or stolen from the office. They were copied directly from my personal laptop. I let that hang in the air for a moment, then added, my voice dropping even lower. The laptop I'd brought with me to a family dinner at my parents' house that same weekend. I was trying to meet a deadline, working late at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed. My eyes found Samantha in the crowd, found her white face and trembling lips, and I held her gaze as I spoke my next words. Only family was there that weekend. Only family had access to that house. Only family knew my password. Samantha's face drained of every drop of color, going from flushed bride to ghostly pale in the space of a heartbeat. "I didn't," she started, her voice strangled. "That's not, I never..." But I was already turning away, already moving toward the door, leaving behind the explosion I'd detonated. The room erupted into chaos behind me, voices raised in shock and speculation, Samantha's protests lost in the cacophony, my mother's sharp, "Renee, stop this right now," falling on ears that no longer cared what she commanded. Someone yelled, "Is this true?" Another voice called out, "Someone get this on video." A third shouted something about calling lawyers. I pushed through the ornate doors and out into the warm evening air, crossing the parking area toward my rental car with steady steps, while behind me through the open doors I could hear the wedding dissolving into scandal. The valet rushed to get my keys, his eyes wide with the gossip he'd just witnessed through the windows. By the time I pulled onto the highway heading back to Chicago, my phone was already buzzing with notifications. Text messages from colleagues who'd somehow heard already. News alerts from industry publications. And then, as I drove through the darkening countryside, the first social media notifications started coming through. Someone had posted the video. Multiple someones from multiple angles. By morning, the internet had chosen its villain. And for once, it wasn't me. I made it back to Chicago around midnight, parked in my building's underground garage, and rode the elevator up to my penthouse in silence. My phone had been buzzing non-stop for the last hour of the drive, vibrating against the center console like an angry hornet, but I'd ignored it. I poured myself a glass of wine, collapsed onto my sofa, still wearing my Armani dress, and finally looked at my notifications. 63 text messages, 147 emails, 32 missed calls. And my social media accounts, which I barely used, were exploding with activity I couldn't begin to process. I opened Twitter first and watched my carefully constructed private life detonate into public spectacle. The video had been posted by at least a dozen different wedding guests, each from a slightly different angle, each capturing the same devastating moment. Within 12 hours, the view count had hit 4 million and was climbing exponentially. The hashtag #TrashSeatSister was trending nationally, sitting at number 2 below some celebrity divorce and above a political scandal. I watched strangers dissect my family dynamics, analyze Samantha's cruelty, speculate about Mark's guilt. They created memes using screenshots of Samantha's shocked face. They found my company website and flooded it with supportive messages. By morning, legitimate news outlets had picked up the story. CNN ran a segment titled "Tech CEO Exposes Family Betrayal at Sister's Wedding." Forbes published an article, "When the Trash Sister is Actually Worth $200 million." The New York Times lifestyle section featured an opinion piece called "The Hallway Seat Heard Round the World: What Viral Wedding Drama Reveals About Family Favoritism." My assistant Jennifer called at 7 in the morning, her voice strained with professional panic, to tell me we'd received over 300 interview requests, and my office voicemail was full. Samantha's Instagram, which had been a carefully curated gallery of wedding photos and aspirational lifestyle content, was now a war zone. Thousands of comments poured in calling her cruel, entitled, materialistic, a bully, a narcissist. People dug through her old posts, finding inconsistencies and evidence of the privilege she'd always taken for granted. Her follower count was plummeting by the hour. Mark's employer, a mid-tier consulting firm called Dalton Associates, no relation, ironically issued a terse statement on their website. "We are aware of allegations regarding Mark Dalton's professional conduct during his tenure at a previous employer. We are conducting an internal investigation and will take appropriate action." I sat on my sofa surrounded by the debris of my quiet, controlled life and felt nauseated. This wasn't what I'd wanted. I'd gone to that wedding for closure, for the chance to finally see my family as they truly were and walk away free. I'd never intended to create a viral scandal to turn Samantha into a national symbol of sibling cruelty, to watch my private pain become entertainment for millions of strangers. The comments supporting me should have felt validating, but instead they felt invasive, like everyone was picking through the wreckage of my family and taking souvenirs. 3 days after the wedding, Samantha posted a video. Jennifer sent me the link with a message that just said, "You need to see this." I clicked through to Instagram, where Samantha had uploaded a 10-minute video titled, "My Truth," in shaky script. She sat in what looked like her apartment, eyes red and swollen, makeup minimal, her voice trembling as she spoke directly to the camera. "I want to address what happened at my wedding." She began, tears already spilling down her cheeks. "My sister has always been jealous of me ever since we were kids. She's incredibly successful, which I'm proud of, but she's never been able to accept that our parents loved us equally. She's twisting a family disagreement, a moment of poor judgment on my part, into something ugly and vindictive because she can't stand seeing me happy." I watched in disbelief as she continued rewriting history with every sentence. "Yes, we seated her at an overflow table, but only because she RSVP'd at the absolute last minute, and all the main seating was already finalized. We were trying to accommodate her. And, yes, I said something. I regret. I was stressed it was my wedding day. I made a thoughtless comment. But she's using her money and her platform to destroy my reputation, to ruin my marriage, to turn strangers against me when they don't know the full story." The comments section erupted immediately. "Girl, we saw the original video. You were cruel and deliberate. Gaslighting 101 right here. Your sister is a self-made millionaire who built a company from nothing, and you called her trash at your wedding. Own it." The seating chart literally had her name spelled wrong. That wasn't an accident. Within 6 hours, the video had been viewed 2 million times, but the ratio of supportive to critical comments was devastatingly lopsided. Samantha deleted it 24 hours later, but screenshots had already proliferated across every platform. The internet never forgets, and it wasn't interested in her version of events. I spent that week working from home, avoiding my office, declining every interview request, and trying to pretend my life hadn't been turned inside out for public consumption. Then, exactly 1 week after the wedding, I received a LinkedIn message that changed everything. The sender was Eleanor Vance. I had to read the name 3 times before I believed it. Eleanor Vance, 68 years old, worth an estimated $3 billion, legendary in tech circles for being one of the first women to build a Silicon Valley unicorn back in the 90s, when venture capital barely acknowledged that women existed. She'd sold her company for $800 million in 2005 and had spent the subsequent decades investing in female-founded startups and advocating for workplace equity. She was a hero, an icon, someone I'd admired from afar for years but never dreamed of meeting. Her message was brief and devastating. "I sat at the trash table once too, figuratively but still. Now I own the vineyard. Let's talk." We met for coffee 3 days later at a quiet cafe in Lincoln Park, far from my office, and the prying eyes of people who might recognize me from the viral videos. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, dressed in elegant casual clothes that whispered wealth rather than shouted it. Her silver hair cut in a sharp bob, her eyes sharp and assessing behind designer frames. She ordered an espresso, waited until we were settled, and then told me her story. How her father had funded her brother's business school education but told her that college was wasted on girls. How she'd built her first company with credit card debt and sheer determination. How her family had mocked her ambitions until she became too successful to ignore, and even then they'd found ways to diminish her achievements. "The difference between you and me," Eleanor said, stirring sugar into her espresso with precise movements, "is that you got your vindication early. I spent 20 years proving myself before my family acknowledged I existed. You're 38 and already worth $200 million. Imagine what you could do if you stopped hiding." I bristled at the word hiding. "I'm not hiding. I built a company. I have a reputation in my industry." "A reputation that 300 million people now know about because of a wedding video you didn't even want posted," Eleanor said gently. "You've been given a platform, Renee. A massive one. The question is what you're going to do with it." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Partner with me on the Green Cities Initiative, $500 million joint venture sustainable urban development in 20 mid-sized American cities. We'll create jobs, housing, community spaces. We'll prove that green architecture isn't just for wealthy coastal elites." My heart raced. This was the kind of opportunity that came once in a career if you were lucky. "But there's one condition," Eleanor continued. "You go public with your full story. Documentary interviews, everything. The world needs to see what women endure to succeed, how we survive families that should protect us but instead sabotage us. Your silence has protected them for too long." I thought about the viral videos, the invasion of privacy, the nauseating exposure of my worst family moments. Eleanor smiled, reading my hesitation. "You've been silent for too long. Let them hear you roar." I spent the next 6 weeks negotiating the partnership with Eleanor, working through the legal complexities of a $500 million joint venture, while the internet continued its fascination with my family drama. The viral videos eventually faded from trending topics, replaced by newer scandals and fresher outrage, but the damage to Samantha and Mark was permanent and public. I tried to focus on work on the future Eleanor was offering, on anything except the nauseating awareness that my private pain had become entertainment. Then, on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after the wedding, a thick envelope arrived at my office via certified mail. The return address read, Thompson & Associates Legal Services, with a downtown Chicago address I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal letter on heavy legal stationery, and the signature at the bottom made my hands go still. May Thompson, Esquire, retired. May. The elderly woman in the service uniform who'd brought me champagne and cryptic warnings. Who'd known my grandfather. Who'd told me the trash takes itself out. I read the letter 3 times each pass, revealing new layers of a plan I'd never suspected existed. Dear Ms. Steele, it began in precise legal language. I am writing to inform you of matters pertaining to the estate of Robert James Steele, deceased, in which I served as executor. Your grandfather passed away 12 years ago, as you know. What you may not know is that his will included a substantial bequest to your sister Samantha Rose Steele, contingent upon specific conditions related to her treatment of you at her wedding. My breath caught. I set the letter down, picked it up again, kept reading. I was not employed by Solara Estate Vineyard as standard venue staff. I was hired specifically to attend your sister's wedding, observe interactions involving you, and document whether the conditions of the bequest were satisfied. I witnessed multiple violations of the terms set forth in your grandfather's will. Enclosed, you will find photographic evidence, video documentation, and witness statements supporting these findings. The rest of the package contained exactly what May had promised. Timestamp photographs of me sitting at the hallway overflow table, the Renee Steele place card clearly visible. Video clips from May's perspective. Apparently she'd worn a small camera concealed in her uniform, capturing Samantha's "trash belongs with trash" comment. My parents' silent complicity, the entire humiliating scene. Witness statements from Jessica and Ryan, the young couple who'd been seated with me, describing the substandard table setting and Samantha's public mockery. The will's specific language was attached as an exhibit, and I read my grandfather's words with tears blurring my vision. Samantha Rose Steele shall receive $2 million from the Robert James Steele Trust upon the occasion of her wedding, provided that the following conditions are met. First, Renee Steele must be invited to attend as a guest in good standing with proper advance notice and courtesy. Second, Renee Steele must be seated at a main reception table appropriate for immediate family, not isolated, separated, or relegated to overflow seating. Third, no derogatory, demeaning, or cruel remarks about Renee Steele shall be made publicly by Samantha Rose Steele or by Robert and Margaret Steele parents during the wedding event. The terms continued. Violation of any condition results in immediate forfeiture of the bequest. Forfeited funds shall be transferred to establish the Renee Steele Foundation for the benefit of young women pursuing careers in architecture and engineering. May Thompson is granted full authority to determine compliance and initiate legal action as necessary. My grandfather had known. 12 years ago, before his death, he'd looked at his family and understood exactly what they were capable of. He'd built in protection consequences, a final lesson about dignity that would outlive him by more than a decade. May's letter concluded with additional findings that made my stomach turn. My parents had signed documents as witnesses when Samantha had accessed the trust fund 6 months before the wedding, withdrawing $150,000 to cover venue deposits, catering contracts, and her wedding gown. They'd been present when the trust attorney explained the conditions. They'd known about every requirement: the proper seating, the prohibition on cruel remarks, the standards of basic decency, and they'd chosen to hide this information from Samantha, gambling that the soft language about dignity and respect wouldn't be legally enforceable. They'd been wrong. May's final paragraph invited me to her office to discuss next steps. I called immediately and scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon. Her office was in a historic building near the courthouse, the kind of space that had probably witnessed 100 years of legal battles and hard-won victories. May greeted me in a conference room looking exactly as she had at the wedding, but somehow more herself, authoritative, sharp-eyed, wearing a tailored suit instead of a service uniform. "Your grandfather was my law school mentor," May explained as we sat down. "He put himself through night school while working construction, became a union lawyer, fought for workers' rights for 40 years. He was one of the finest men I've ever known." She paused, her eyes sad. "And he was heartbroken by how his son treated you. He called me 2 weeks before he died and asked me to execute this plan. He wanted you to know you were loved even if he hadn't fought hard enough to show it while he was alive." "Why did he leave money to Samantha at all?" I asked, my voice thick. "Why not just give it all to me?" May smiled. "Because he believed people could change. He hoped that knowing there were consequences, that someone was watching, might teach your sister to be kind. He gave her a chance to do the right thing. She chose not to take it." She spread the documentation across the table: photographs, videos, witness statements, copies of the trust documents my parents had signed. "Your grandfather wanted them to learn that cruelty has a price. The question is whether you want to enforce that lesson." I looked at the evidence of my family's calculated cruelty, at proof that they'd known exactly what they were doing, and had done it anyway. I thought about Samantha using $150,000 of grandfather's money to fund the wedding where she'd called me trash. I thought about my parents signing documents acknowledging conditions they'd then conspired to violate. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. "You've been silent for too long." I looked at May, this woman who'd spent 6 weeks gathering evidence to honor a promise she'd made to a dying man 12 years ago, and I made my decision. File the lawsuit. Every word of it. May filed the lawsuit on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning my phone was ringing with reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of a $2 million inheritance dispute involving the viral wedding family. I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers and threw myself into the only 2 things that felt real and meaningful: My partnership negotiations with Eleanor and my volunteer work at the Chicago Youth Architecture Program, a nonprofit I'd been quietly funding for years but had never actually visited until now. The program operated out of a converted warehouse in Pilsen, teaching design skills to underserved teenagers who'd never considered architecture as a viable career path. I showed up on a Wednesday evening, introduced myself to the program director, and asked if I could review student portfolios and offer mentorship. That's where I met Lila Chen. She sat alone at a drafting table in the corner, hunched over a detailed scale model of what appeared to be affordable housing units. She was 16, slight and serious, with black hair pulled into a messy ponytail and paint-stained fingers moving with the kind of precision that couldn't be taught. The other students worked in groups, laughing and chatting, but Lila existed in a bubble of intense focus that I recognized immediately because I'd lived in that same bubble at her age. I approached her table quietly, not wanting to startle her. "May I see what you're working on?" She looked up with dark eyes that held more wariness than a 16-year-old should carry, then gestured to her model. "It's a modular housing concept for single mothers. Each unit is 450 square feet, but designed to feel larger through vertical space and natural light. The materials are sustainable and the construction method allows for rapid deployment." I studied her work for a long moment. The design was sophisticated, thoughtful, showing an understanding of both human needs and practical constraints that most architecture students didn't grasp until graduate school. "This is extraordinary. How long have you been studying architecture?" 2 years, since I was 14. My mom left when I was 13 and I needed something to focus on. Building things helps. She said it matter-of-factly, like abandonment was just another design constraint to work around. Over the following weeks, I returned to the program every Wednesday evening, and Lila and I fell into an easy mentorship that felt less like teaching and more like recognition. She reminded me so viscerally of my younger self, that desperate hunger to create something permanent and beautiful, that belief that if you could just build something good enough, maybe you'd finally be worth loving. One evening after the other students had left, she showed me her full portfolio and told me her story. Her mother had left 3 years ago with nothing but a handwritten note that Lila kept folded in her wallet, punishment and motivation in equal measure. "I can't be seen with a daughter who looks like this. You're an embarrassment. I'm sorry, but I have to think of myself." Lila had struggled with body dysmorphia and depression ever since seeing herself through her mother's cruel lens, believing she was fundamentally unworthy of love because of her appearance. "My dad tries," Lila said, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she closed her portfolio. "He tells me I'm beautiful, that my mom was wrong, but I can't believe him. How do you trust anything when the person who's supposed to love you most just leaves?" I knew that question. I'd asked it 1,000 different ways about my own mother, my own family. I'd built an empire trying to answer it. She mentioned her father casually over the following sessions, a lawyer who'd recently made partner, who worked long hours but never missed her school events, who was trying his best to be both parents. "His name is David Chen," she said one evening while we worked side by side on her college application portfolio. "He's probably too protective, but I know he's just scared of losing me too." David Chen. The name hit me like a physical blow. I set down the pencil I'd been holding and took a breath that felt like breaking. David Chen had been my first love, my partner through my early 20s when I was clawing my way through MIT and then launching Steel Dynamics. He'd wanted marriage, children, a life built together. I'd wanted success so desperately that I'd sacrificed everything else, working 100-hour weeks, canceling dates, choosing my company over him again and again until he finally left. He'd told me he loved me but couldn't compete with my need to prove something to people who would never acknowledge it. We hadn't spoken in 15 years. This brilliant, wounded girl sitting beside me, designing homes for people who'd been abandoned, was David's daughter. The child he'd had with someone else after I'd broken his heart. And that someone else had abandoned Lila for not being pretty enough, had replicated the exact trauma I'd experienced, had created another girl who believed she had to be perfect to deserve love. I didn't tell Lila about the connection, not yet. Instead, I became the mentor I'd needed at 16. I helped her refine her college applications, taught her advanced CAD software, introduced her to contacts in the industry, and most importantly, I listened. I showed up every Wednesday, without fail. I answered her texts about design problems and life problems with equal seriousness. I let her know through consistent presence that she mattered. 6 weeks into our mentorship, Lila had a breakdown in the middle of reviewing her application essay. She'd written about her mother's abandonment, and rereading it had cracked something open. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face, and asked the question I'd heard in my own head for 38 years. Why wasn't I enough for her? What's wrong with me that my own mother couldn't love me? I set down her essay and took both her hands in mine, holding tight while she cried. When she finally looked up, I said the words I'd never been able to say to my younger self. You were always enough, Lila. You've always been enough. She wasn't. The failure was hers, not yours. And I know that's hard to believe because we're taught that mothers love unconditionally, that family means something, that people who hurt us must have good reasons. But sometimes people are just broken and cruel and incapable of seeing the extraordinary person right in front of them. It was the first time I'd said those words aloud about my own family. Hearing them in my voice, seeing Lila's face transform with tentative hope, I realized something fundamental had shifted. Healing wasn't coming from the lawsuit or the viral revenge or even from Eleanor's partnership. It was coming from this, from breaking the cycle, from being for Lila what no one had been for me, from choosing connection over isolation. That night, after Lila had gone home with her father picking her up as always, I sat in my car in the warehouse parking lot and pulled out my phone. I found David's number. I'd never deleted it even after 15 years, and stared at it for a long time before I finally pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Renee. Not a question, just my name said with a mixture of surprise and something that sounded like relief. David, I need to talk to you about Lila. There was a pause, and then he said something I didn't expect. I was wondering when you'd figure it out. David and I met for coffee the following week, sitting across from each other in a quiet cafe near his law office, 15 years of silence hanging between us like fog. He looked older, of course, silver threading through his dark hairlines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we were young and stupid and in love. But his smile was the same, warm and a little sad, and when he took my hand across the table, I felt something in my chest that I'd thought I'd buried completely. I've been taking Lila to that program for 6 months, he said quietly. When she came home talking about this amazing architect who was mentoring her, who understood her in ways I couldn't, I looked you up. It wasn't hard to figure out. There's only one Renee Steele in Chicago architecture. Why didn't you say something? Because Lila needed you, and I wasn't going to complicate that with our history. He squeezed my hand gently. She's been different these past weeks. Lighter, more hopeful. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Thank you. We talked for 2 hours, catching up on 15 years in fragments and confessions. He told me about his marriage brief troubled ending when his ex-wife decided motherhood didn't fit her self-image. I told him about building steel dynamics, about the wedding, about May, and the lawsuit that was currently tearing my family apart in very public ways. When we finally parted, it wasn't with promises of romance rekindled, but with something better, an agreement to co-mentor Lila together to build the kind of chosen family that biology had failed to provide either of us. I floated through the rest of that week on the strange high of reconnection right up until Eleanor called and asked me to meet her at her downtown office for what she described as a proposal that might make you uncomfortable. Eleanor's office occupied the top floor of a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan, all clean lines and expensive art and floor-to-ceiling windows that made you feel like you were floating above the city. She poured us both coffee from a French press and got straight to the point, which I'd learned was her style. I don't just want a business partnership, she said, settling into the chair across from me. I want to produce a documentary built on silence. It would profile 6 women who succeeded despite family sabotage, myself, you, and 4 others from various industries. Tech, finance, medicine, law. All of us with similar stories of families who tried to break us and failed. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. Eleanor, I don't. Your story would be the centerpiece, she continued, not unkindly but relentlessly. We'd cover your childhood, the stolen college fund, Mark's betrayal, the wedding. Everything. 6 months of production, release it at Sundance, then streaming platforms. Your story will free thousands of women who think they're alone in this. Silence protects abusers, Renee. You know that. I set down my coffee cup with hands that weren't quite steady. I don't want to be a symbol. I don't want to be the poster child for family dysfunction. I just want to build buildings and live in peace. Eleanor's expression softened. You lost that option when the wedding video went viral. You're already a symbol whether you choose it or not. The question is whether you control the narrative or let others control it for you. I left her office with a thick production proposal and a deadline she needed an answer in 2 weeks. That night, I called Dr. Patricia Chen, my therapist, and asked for an emergency session. We met the next morning in her comfortable office with its soft lighting and the kind of furniture that encouraged honesty. I told her about Eleanor's offer, about my terror of exposure, about feeling like I was standing at the edge of a cliff being asked to jump. What scares you more? Dr. Chen asked in that gentle, probing way of hers. Being seen or being misunderstood? I sat with that question for a long time. Both. I'm terrified of being reduced to a victim narrative, of people seeing me as just the sad girl whose family didn't love her instead of the CEO who built something from nothing. I'm scared my professional accomplishments will be overshadowed by family drama, that every article about my company will mention the wedding video first and my architecture second. And I'm terrified of what my parents and Samantha will do if I tell the full story publicly. They'll weaponize my vulnerability. They'll find ways to make me the villain again. They're already doing it with the lawsuit my mother told a reporter I'm seeking attention and hurting the family for profit. Dr. Chen nodded. Those are real fears, valid ones. But you haven't mentioned shame. I looked up sharply. What? For 15 years you've told colleagues your family is private, or that you're not close, but you've never explained why. You've built walls around this part of your life. You've internalized shame about something that wasn't your fault. Maybe telling the truth isn't about revenge or justice, or even helping others. Maybe it's about finally believing that what happened to you was wrong and you don't have to protect the people who hurt you. I cried in her office that day, the kind of ugly crying I'd avoided for decades. When I finally pulled myself together, Dr. Chen asked, "What would it feel like to stop hiding?" I didn't have an answer. But I called Eleanor that afternoon. "I'll do the documentary," I told her. "But I have one non-negotiable condition. I get editorial control over how my family is portrayed. I won't lie, but I won't make them cartoonish villains either. Complexity matters. They're not monsters, they're damaged people who damaged me. That's the truth I want to tell." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then said, "Agreed. When do we start?" Production began 2 weeks later. A film crew followed me through my daily life, capturing B-roll of construction sites and design meetings. We filmed interviews in my office in the warehouse where I mentored Lila in the park, where I sometimes went to think. Eleanor interviewed me for 6 hours over 2 days, asking questions that peeled back layers I'd spent decades building. We filmed Lila talking about mentorship and second chances. We filmed May discussing my grandfather's will and the legal battle that was still unfolding. Eleanor scheduled the documentary for release in 6 months, which gave my family plenty of time to react. They didn't wait long. 3 days after we announced the project via press release, I received a cease and desist letter from an attorney representing Robert and Margaret Steele. The letter claimed that any documentary portraying them in a false or defamatory light would result in legal action for libel, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and invasion of privacy. They demanded we halt production immediately and destroy all footage involving their likenesses or references to them. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, who read it and laughed. They don't have a case. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation, but this tells you they're scared. That night, alone in my apartment with the city lights spread out below me like a carpet of stars, I realized Dr. Chen had been right. The fear wasn't about being seen. It was about fully accepting that I deserved to be seen, that my story mattered, that I wasn't required to protect people who'd never protected me. The battle was escalating from viral videos to courtrooms to competing public narratives. My family wanted silence. Eleanor wanted exposure. And I was caught in the middle, finally understanding that there was no neutral ground, no safe compromise. My mother's lawyer called it defamation. I called it the truth. The judge would decide. The cease and desist letter was just the opening salvo. Over the following 2 weeks, my parents' attorney filed motions attempting to block the documentary leaked selective information to friendly reporters, painting me as vindictive and money-hungry, and threatened everyone involved in the production with legal action. Eleanor's legal team countered every move, and the whole mess became another layer of public spectacle I hadn't wanted, but couldn't avoid. Then, 14 weeks after the wedding, my attorney called with a discovery that changed everything. We've been reviewing financial documents as part of the inheritance lawsuit. Catherine Martinez said, her voice careful in that way lawyers use when they're about to deliver bad news. Your father's bank records show 5 separate payments to Mark Dalton over the past 2 years, $10,000 each labeled as consulting fees. I was in my office reviewing blueprints for the Detroit Community Center project, and I had to set down my coffee to keep from spilling it. Consulting fees for what my father's been retired for 3 years. He worked in insurance. What possible business connection could he have with Mark? Exactly. It doesn't make sense, which is why I kept digging. I'd like your permission to hire a private investigator. These payments suggest something more complicated than we initially thought. I authorized it immediately, and 3 days later the investigator delivered a file that made my stomach turn. Email exchanges between Mark Dalton and my father recovered from Mark's business account through legal discovery in his employer's investigation. The earliest email was dated 2 years and 4 months ago, shortly after Mark had started dating Samantha. Robert. The first email began with false friendliness. Enjoyed meeting you at Samantha's birthday dinner. I've been doing some investing research and came across an interesting connection. Do you remember Margaret Ashford? I believe you two worked together at Midwest Insurance back in the 90s. Her ex-husband is a client of mine, and he mentioned she kept some personal correspondence from that time. Letters quite romantic, actually. Would hate for those to surface after all these years. Might be worth discussing over coffee. The subsequent emails dropped all pretense. Mark wanted information about Steel Dynamics' upcoming project bids, client negotiations, strategic plans. In exchange, he'd keep quiet about an affair my father had apparently conducted 23 years ago with a woman named Margaret Ashford. The emails were methodical, transactional, chilling in their casual cruelty. My father had been providing insider information about my company for 2 years, feeding it to Mark, who then used it to benefit his employer and undermine my bids. My hands shook as I read through the entire file. Then I drove to my parents' house for the first time in 12 years. My father answered the door, looking older than I remembered, grayer, and more stooped, his face collapsing when he saw me standing on the porch holding the file. "Renee, I didn't expect your mother isn't home. She's at her book club." "We need to talk about Mark Dalton and Margaret Ashford." All the color drained from his face. He stepped back wordlessly, and I followed him into the house where I'd grown up, past the living room where my report cards had gone unnoticed, into his study with its insurance industry awards gathering dust on shelves. He sat down heavily in his desk chair and put his head in his hands. I remained standing, the file clutched against my chest like armor. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. 3 days. The investigator found the emails, all of them. Mark blackmailing you for information about my company. You paying him $50,000 over 2 years to keep quiet about an affair from 2 decades ago. My father looked up, and for the first time in my life, I saw him as something other than the distant, passive man who'd watched my childhood from the sidelines. He looked broken. "It was 23 years ago," he said, his voice hoarse. "Before you were born." Margaret worked in my department. We were both unhappy in our marriages, at least I told myself I was unhappy, though looking back I was just selfish and stupid. It lasted 4 months. Her husband found love letters she'd kept, divorced her, and I stayed with your mother because I was too much of a coward to do anything else. The secret stayed buried for over 2 decades. Until Mark found out. He has an investor friend who knows Margaret's ex-husband. Somehow the letters came up and Mark put the pieces together. He approached me 2 years ago, right after he started dating Samantha. Said he was doing due diligence on the family. My father laughed bitterly. "He blackmailed me. Said he'd tell your mother, destroy our marriage, make it public. All I had to do was provide occasional information about Steel Dynamics' business movements." "So you betrayed me. You fed my competitor information that cost me contracts, cost me millions, almost cost me my company." "I tried to minimize the damage," he said desperately. "I only gave him information that was semi-public, things he could have found elsewhere with enough digging. I never gave him actual designs or proprietary technology. I thought I was protecting the marriage, protecting your mother from pain she didn't deserve. While inflicting pain I didn't deserve." My voice was cold, steady, each word precise. "You chose protecting your secret over protecting your daughter. Again." He flinched like I'd struck him. "Renee, I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry. I've been weak your entire life. I let your mother favor Samantha because it was easier than fighting. I let them steal your college money because confronting it would have meant taking responsibility. And I let Mark blackmail me because I was too ashamed to tell the truth. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking you to understand I'm not a villain. I'm just weak." I looked at this man who'd shaped my life through his absences and his silence, and I felt something more complicated than anger. He wasn't evil. He wasn't even particularly malicious. He was just a coward who'd made terrible choices and kept making them, always choosing the path of least resistance, even when it meant sacrificing his own daughter. "Mark committed a federal crime," I said quietly. "Blackmail, extortion, whatever the legal term is. I could report this to the FBI. They'd investigate, probably prosecute. He'd go to prison." Hope flickered in my father's eyes. But that would mean you'd have to testify. The affair would become public record. Mom would find out in the worst possible way. Your marriage would implode, and it would be my fault for setting it in motion." "I'll do it," my father said immediately. "I'll testify. I'll tell your mother myself before it goes public. This is my mess. I should have been honest from the beginning. Maybe it's time I finally stopped being a coward." I studied his face, looking for manipulation or self-preservation, but all I saw was exhaustion and resignation. He was ready to burn down his own life if it meant stopping Mark. The question was whether I was ready to light the match. "I need to think about this," I said finally. "I need to figure out if destroying Mark is worth destroying everything else." I left my father sitting in his study and drove back to my apartment, the file on the passenger seat like a bomb waiting to detonate. That evening, I sat on my balcony overlooking the city and realized something Dr. Chen had tried to tell me months ago. Revenge was never simple. Hurting the guilty meant hurting everyone connected to them. Justice required collateral damage, and I had to decide if the cost was worth paying. I picked up my phone and dialed the FBI's white-collar crime hotline. My father's secret was about to become evidence. The FBI agent assigned to my case was Special Agent Maria Torres, a woman in her mid-40s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that had seen every variety of human weakness. We met in my attorney's conference room 3 days after I'd made the call. Me, my father, Catherine Martinez, and Agent Torres with her neat folder of documents and her complete lack of sympathy for my father's predicament. "Mr. Steele," she began arranging papers on the table with precise movements. "What Mark Dalton has done to you constitutes extortion under federal statute, 18 U.S.C., Sector 875. If you're willing to cooperate, wear a wire document. His demands allow us to record communications. We can build a case strong enough to put him in federal prison for 5 to 10 years. My father sat hunched in his chair looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. "My wife can't know about this. The affair was 23 years ago. She doesn't deserve to be hurt now because of my mistakes back then." Agent Torres's expression didn't soften. "Sir, I understand your concern, but let me be direct. Your wife is likely going to find out eventually. These things have a way of surfacing, especially in federal trials. The question isn't whether she'll find out, it's whether you want her to hear it from you in private or from a defense attorney destroying your credibility on a witness stand in open court. Trust me, the second option is significantly more painful." I watched my father's face crumble, watched him realize there was no path forward that didn't involve pain and exposure, and I felt a confusing mixture of pity and anger. This was the man who'd stood silent while my mother stole my college fund, who'd watched Samantha mock me at that wedding without saying a word, who'd betrayed my company to save his own skin. But he was also just a weak, frightened man who'd made terrible choices and was finally being forced to face consequences. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "I'll wear the wire. I'll testify. Whatever you need." Over the next 3 weeks, my father became an FBI informant in his own blackmail case. Agent Torres fitted him with recording equipment so sophisticated it was invisible under his clothing. He arranged 2 meetings with Mark Dalton under the pretense of needing to discuss the current situation with the lawsuit and the documentary. I listened to the recordings afterward in Agent Torres's office, my hands clenched in my lap, my stomach churning with each damning word. Mark was brazen on the recordings, his voice cocky and threatening in equal measure. "Robert, the inheritance lawsuit is getting messy. Samantha's stressed. I need you to get Renee to back off." When my father protested that he had no influence over me, Mark's tone turned vicious. "Then maybe it's time the Ashford situation became public knowledge. I'm sure the documentary would love that angle. And I'd hate for Renee's upcoming IPO plans to be derailed by family scandal." The second recording was even worse. Mark demanded $50,000 in cash for my silence and cooperation, threatening to not only expose the affair, but to fabricate additional allegations about my father's business practices if he didn't comply. It was textbook extortion delivered with the confidence of someone who'd gotten away with it for 2 years and thought he was untouchable. Agent Torres arrested Mark on a Wednesday morning at his office downtown. I wasn't there, but Catherine called me immediately with the news. Within an hour, media outlets were running the story. Groom from viral wedding video arrested on federal extortion charges. My phone started ringing off the hook, reporters' colleagues. People I hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to know what was happening. Then Samantha called. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Her voice was hysterical, shrill with panic and confusion. "Renee, what did you do?" "They arrested Mark at work. They took him away in handcuffs. His company fired him on the spot. You have to fix this. You have to tell them it's a mistake." "I didn't arrest him, Samantha. The FBI did based on evidence of federal crimes. This has nothing to do with me." "Of course it has to do with you," she screamed. "You've been trying to destroy us since the wedding. You and your lawsuit and your documentary. You won't be happy until we're all ruined." "Mark extorted our father for 2 years," I said coldly. "He blackmailed him for money and information. He committed serious crimes. I didn't make him do that. He chose it himself." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Samantha's voice came back smaller, confused. "What are you talking about? What blackmail?" I realized then that she didn't know. Mark had kept his criminal enterprise separate from his marriage, playing the devoted husband, while systematically destroying both her family and mine. Ask your lawyer, I said, suddenly exhausted. The evidence will come out in discovery. I'm done explaining your husband's crimes to you. I hung up before she could respond. That evening, I drove to my childhood home for the second time in 2 weeks. My mother answered the door looking visibly aged, her hair grayer than I remembered her face, lined with stress and confusion. "Renee, we don't have anything to say to you. Our attorney advised us not to—" "I'm not here to see you. I need to speak to Dad." She started to protest, but my father appeared in the hallway behind her. "Margaret, it's fine. Let her in." I followed him to his study, the same room where we'd met before, where he'd confessed his affair and his cowardice. He closed the door and stood there looking lost, like he didn't know what to do with his hands. "I gave the FBI everything they needed," I said without preamble. "The recordings, the documentation, all of it. Mark is going to prison. They have enough evidence for multiple charges. He'll be gone for years." My father nodded slowly. "And the affair, Margaret Ashford?" "That depends on you. I didn't tell them more than was necessary for the blackmail case. The affair is relevant as Mark's leverage, but the specific details don't have to be in the public record if you tell Mom yourself first. Agent Torres said if you're upfront about it in your testimony, they can handle it carefully. But if you wait, if you try to hide it, Mark's defense attorney will use it to destroy you in court, and Mom will find out in the worst possible way." He was crying now, tears running down his face unchecked. "Why would you protect me after everything I've done, everything I've failed to do? Why would you show me any mercy?" I looked at this man who'd shaped my life through his absences, his silences, his cowardice, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness that was too big, too generous for what I felt, but maybe the beginning of something like understanding. "Because you're still my father," I said quietly. "And because I've learned that destroying you won't heal me. You'll have to live with what you've done. You'll have to face Mom and tell her the truth and deal with the consequences. But I'm not going to be the weapon that destroys you. I'm done letting this family turn me into something cruel." I left him standing there in his study and drove home through the dark city streets, feeling lighter and heavier all at once, like I'd set down a burden I didn't know I'd been carrying but picked up a different weight in its place. Mercy, I learned, doesn't mean forgetting. It means refusing to become what hurt you. 5 months after the wedding that broke everything open, Eleanor and I stood together at a podium in the Chicago Architectural Center, facing a room packed with reporters, cameras, and industry leaders who'd come to witness what the press releases had promised would be a transformative announcement. The media turnout was staggering, not just architecture trades, but CNN, Forbes, the New York Times local news stations, with their satellite trucks parked outside. They'd come for the viral wedding sister, the woman whose family drama had captivated millions. But Eleanor and I were determined to give them something bigger. Eleanor spoke first, her voice commanding the room with the authority of someone who'd built empires and didn't need to raise her volume to be heard. She outlined the Green Cities Initiative, a $500 million joint venture between her investment firm and Steel Dynamics, to build sustainable, affordable housing in 10 mid-sized American cities. Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Buffalo. Milwaukee, places that had been written off, dismissed, told their best days were behind them. We'd prove otherwise. Then it was my turn. I stepped to the microphone, looked out at the sea of faces and cameras, and spoke from a place of hard-won clarity. "This initiative is about second chances," I said. "About building something meaningful from nothing. About proving that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. And it's about lifting other women up instead of tearing them down." I paused, letting that land. "To fund our scholarship program and mentorship initiative, I'm establishing the Steel Heart Foundation, which will be endowed with funds from a recently settled inheritance dispute." The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions over each other, photographers surged forward. I didn't name Samantha directly, I didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew the story, knew about May's lawsuit, knew that my sister had forfeited $2 million by choosing cruelty over kindness. That money, my grandfather's final lesson in consequences, would now fund opportunities for young women who'd been rejected, dismissed, or told they weren't enough. The timing of the press conference wasn't accidental. That same morning, Mark Dalton was being arraigned in federal court on multiple counts of extortion. Eleanor's team had coordinated the schedules deliberately, ensuring maximum media coverage of both events. While we stood in the architectural center talking about building futures, Mark stood in a courthouse defending against charges that could send him to prison for a decade. The news coverage that followed was exhaustive and brutal. Cameras caught Samantha leaving the courthouse looking nothing like the glowing bride from 5 months ago. She wore oversized sunglasses that couldn't hide the gauntness of her face, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her clothes rumpled. Her Instagram account, which had once been a carefully curated gallery of aspirational lifestyle content, was now set to private with her follower count decimated. My parents were photographed leaving their attorney's office that same afternoon, both of them ashen-faced and aged beyond their years, walking to their car without speaking to each other. The local evening news ran a special segment, From Viral Wedding to Federal Courthouse, the Dalton Steele Family Saga. They played clips from the original wedding video footage of my press conference shots of Mark in handcuffs and interviews with legal experts discussing both the criminal case and the inheritance lawsuit. Public opinion was split down the middle. Half the comments praised my success and called it justice. The other half accused me of being vindictive of using my wealth and platform to destroy people who'd already suffered enough. Late that night, alone in my office after everyone else had gone home, I found an article in The Atlantic titled, "When Does Justice Become Cruelty? The Renee Steele Question." The author, a ethics professor, argued that while my family's treatment of me had been wrong, my response had crossed lines into disproportionate revenge. The piece was thoughtful, nuanced, and it gutted me. I read it 3 times, and by the third pass my eyes were burning with tears I refused to let fall. I drove home to my penthouse and stood at the windows overlooking the city, surrounded by evidence of everything I'd achieved. Awards lined my shelves. Magazine covers featuring my face hung on the walls. My company was thriving. My partnership with Eleanor would change lives. My foundation would help hundreds of young women. I'd won every battle I'd set out to win, and I felt completely empty. My phone rang around 10. David's name appeared on the screen, and I answered without thinking. "I saw the press conference," he said gently. "It was brilliant. Congratulations." "Thank you." My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Renee, are you okay?" I looked around my perfect, pristine apartment with its expensive furniture and complete absence of anything personal, anything warm, anything that suggested a human being actually lived here. "I wanted them to hurt the way they hurt me," I whispered. "My whole life I wanted them to see me, to acknowledge what they'd done, to feel even a fraction of the pain they caused. And now they do. Samantha's life is destroyed. My father's marriage is hanging by a thread. Mark is going to prison. And I just feel empty." David was quiet for a moment. "Maybe because revenge was never the point. Healing is. And you can't heal by making them bleed. You can win every fight and still lose yourself in the process." After we hung up, I sat in the dark and asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for months. What do I actually want? Not what did I deserve, not what was fair, not what would teach them lessons or make them sorry. What did I want for my own life, my own future, my own peace? The answer wasn't to win. It wasn't to destroy them. It wasn't even to make them acknowledge what they did. The answer was something quieter, harder, more terrifying than revenge had ever been. I wanted to be free. For the first time in months, I asked myself, what do I actually want? And the answer wasn't to win. I spent the week after the press conference moving through my days in a fog of professional triumph and personal hollowness, smiling for cameras and signing partnership documents, while feeling like I was watching my own life from a distance. Then David called and asked to meet at his law office, and something in his tone told me this wasn't a friendly coffee invitation. His office was downtown, sleek and professional, with law books lining mahogany shelves and framed degrees that marked the career he'd built after I'd broken his heart. He closed the door behind me and gestured to a chair, and I noticed he didn't sit behind his desk but pulled up a chair across from me, eliminating the professional barrier between us. "I need to talk to you about Lila," he began, his voice careful. "She told me everything. The lawsuit, the documentary, the press conference, all of it. She follows every development, reads every article. And Renee, she looks up to you. You've been incredible for her, and I'm grateful. But I'm also worried." I felt myself bristle, my defenses rising automatically. "Worried about what?" "About the model you're setting. About what she's learning by watching how you handle conflict." He leaned forward, his eyes holding mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. "Is this really what you want to teach her? That standing up for yourself means annihilating everyone who hurt you? That justice requires total destruction?" "I'm standing up for myself," I said, hearing my voice go cold and hard. "Isn't that what you told me to do 15 years ago? Stop letting people walk all over me? Stop accepting crumbs and calling it love?" David's expression turned sad. "I told you to stand up for yourself, not to declare war on everyone who's ever hurt you. There's a difference between boundaries and warfare, Renee. Boundaries protect you. Warfare just creates more casualties." "They earned every consequence they're facing," I said, but my voice wavered slightly. "My sister called me trash at her wedding in front of 300 people. My parents stole my college fund and never apologized. Mark blackmailed my father and sabotaged my company. They all made their choices." "They did," David agreed. "And they were terrible choices that hurt you deeply. I'm not saying you should have stayed silent, but Lila is watching you prosecute your family like they're war criminals, and she's learning that this is what strength looks like. Is that really the lesson you want her to internalize?" His words hit something tender inside me, something I'd been avoiding. I thought about Lila sitting in that warehouse designing homes for abandoned people, carrying her mother's rejection like a stone in her chest. What would she learn from watching me turn my pain into a weapon? David seemed to sense my uncertainty, because his voice softened. "There's something I never told you about Lila's mother. She didn't just leave because Lila wasn't pretty enough by her standards. She left because she was 42 and terrified of aging, of becoming invisible, of losing the only value she'd ever been taught to cultivate. She looked at Lila and saw a younger version of herself, and it broke something in her. She projected all her self-hatred onto our daughter and ran away rather than face it." I felt tears prick my eyes. "That doesn't excuse what she did to Lila." "No, it doesn't. But understanding it might help Lila heal. Hurt people, Renee. Your sister wasn't born cruel. She was raised in a house where love was conditional, where she had to perform perfection to get attention. Your mother wasn't born cold. She's carrying wounds from her own childhood that she never healed, so she passed them down instead. That doesn't make what they did to you okay, but it might help you see them as broken people instead of villains in your story." "So I'm supposed to just forgive them?" I asked, my voice rising. "Pretend 38 years of rejection didn't happen. Send them a card that says, 'I understand you were traumatized, so it's fine that you traumatized me.'" "No," David said firmly. "You're supposed to stop letting them define you, even now, especially now. Your entire life is organized around what they did to you. You build buildings to prove you're valuable. You accumulate wealth to show you're worthy. You destroy them in court to demonstrate you're powerful. But Renee, you're still giving them all the power. Even your revenge is about them." I stood up abruptly, needing to move to escape the truth of what he was saying. "I should go." "One more thing," David said as I reached for the door. "Lila asked me yesterday if I thought revenge made people happy. She's 16 years old, and she's wondering if destroying the people who hurt you is the path to healing. What should I tell her?" I left without answering because I didn't have one. That night I couldn't sleep. I pulled up the raw documentary footage on my laptop and started watching the interviews Eleanor's team had filmed. There was a segment where the interviewer asked me to describe Samantha, and I watched myself on screen, looking fierce and articulate and absolutely certain. My sister was born selfish, I heard myself say. She's always been jealous of anything I achieved, always needed to be the center of attention. It's just who she is, fundamentally. The editor had left a note in the margin. "Do you want to keep this? It sounds reductive, doesn't it?" I watched that clip 5 times, seeing my face twist with contempt, hearing the absolute certainty in my voice, as I reduced 38 years of complicated family dysfunction into a simple narrative where I was the hero and Samantha was the villain. I was doing exactly what had been done to me, flattening a complex human being into a one-dimensional character that fit my story. I thought about Samantha at 7 years old, desperate for approval, learning that love in our house was a competition she had to win. I thought about her at 15 watching me leave for college while she stayed behind, probably terrified she'd never be smart enough or independent enough to escape. I thought about her at 30, marrying a man who was using her to get to me, building a life on foundations she didn't know were already crumbling. She'd hurt me. God, she'd hurt me so badly. But she was also just a person who'd been damaged by the same broken family system that had damaged me, and she'd responded by trying to win a game that was rigged from the start. I thought about Lila watching this documentary, learning that the path to healing ran through public destruction and perfect righteousness. I thought about David's question, "Is this the model you want to set?" At 2 a.m, I called Eleanor. She answered groggily, and I didn't apologize for the hour. "I need to re-edit my sections of the documentary," I said. "All of them." "Renee, we're 3 months from release. The edit is locked." "Then unlock it. I need to tell the whole truth, Eleanor, not just the parts that make me look righteous. My family hurt me, but I'm not blameless in how this escalated. I used my platform as a weapon. I turned private pain into public spectacle. And if this documentary is supposed to help women heal, then it needs to show what actual healing looks like, not just what revenge looks like." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "This will complicate the narrative. Make it messier." "Good," I said, "because the truth is messy. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the bravest thing wasn't revenge. Maybe it was letting go." I spent 3 weeks re-editing the documentary, working with Eleanor's team to add nuance and complexity to sections that had been too one-sided, too righteous. I recorded new interviews where I acknowledged my own role in escalating the conflict, admitted that public humiliation wasn't justice, confessed that I'd used my platform as a weapon when I could have chosen privacy. It was harder than any work I'd ever done, stripping away the armor of righteous anger and standing naked in my own complicity. Then, 7 months after the wedding that had detonated my family, my father called. His voice was strained, older somehow, when he said, "Renee, I need to ask you something, and I'll understand if you say no. Your mother and we're separating. After everything that's happened, everything that's come out, she can't forgive me, and I don't blame her. But she needs somewhere to stay temporarily, and Samantha's apartment is too small, and I just thought, she can stay in my guest house." I heard myself say the words coming out before I'd fully processed them. "It's separate from the main house. She'll have privacy." My father's relief was audible. "Thank you. I know I have no right to ask this of you. I'll bring her over this weekend." When my mother arrived on Saturday afternoon, I barely recognized her. She'd always been so carefully put together, hairstyled, makeup, perfect clothes pressed and coordinated. The woman who stepped out of my father's car was shockingly diminished. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to have shrunk. Her hair was gray at the roots, uncombed. She looked around my property with confusion, clutching a suitcase in one hand, while my father carried 2 more. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice querulous. "Robert, I thought we were going to Samantha's." "This is Renee's house, Margaret. Remember, we talked about this morning." She looked at me, then her eyes sliding past my face without recognition, then focusing again. "Samantha, when did you cut your hair?" My father's face crumpled. That's Renee Margaret, your older daughter." "Oh." She blinked several times. "Of course. I'm sorry, I'm just tired from the drive." I showed her to the guest house, a small cottage on the edge of my property that I'd built for visiting colleagues. She seemed confused about which suitcase held her medications, opening and closing them repeatedly, growing increasingly agitated until I helped her find the prescription bottles. That night, I brought her dinner and found her sitting in the dark because she'd forgotten where the light switches were. Over the following week, I watched her carefully cataloging behaviors that felt wrong. She'd forget conversations we'd had that same morning. She left the stove on after making tea, nearly starting a fire. She became upset when she couldn't find her reading glasses, searching frantically while they sat on top of her head. She'd start sentences and lose the thread mid-thought, her face clouding with frustration at her own mental lapses. This wasn't stress. This was something else. I made an appointment with a neurologist without telling my father, not wanting to alarm him if I was wrong. Dr. Sarah Patel was in her 50s, calm and thorough, and she put my mother through a battery of tests over 3 visits. Cognitive assessments where my mother struggled to remember 3 words after 5 minutes. An MRI that showed brain changes consistent with neurodegeneration. Blood work to rule out other causes. When Dr. Patel called me into her office to discuss the results, my mother was in the waiting room working on a child's puzzle, and I felt something crack in my chest. "Your mother has early-stage Alzheimer's disease," Dr. Patel said gently. "Based on the progression we're seeing and the history you've provided, I'd estimate she's been symptomatic for 2 to 3 years, possibly longer." The room seemed to tilt. 2 to 3 years. That would mean... The symptoms often start subtly. Mood changes, difficulty with complex tasks, memory inconsistencies, especially around recent events. Long-term memories typically stay intact much longer, which is why she might remember your childhood clearly, but forget what she had for breakfast. I thought about my mother's increasing coldness over the past few years, her repetition of old grievances, her inability to acknowledge my professional achievements no matter how many times I'd been featured in major publications. I'd interpreted it as deliberate cruelty, as willful blindness. But what if it had been her brain literally losing the ability to form new memories, to update her perception of who I was? How much of her behavior was the disease? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How much was her... Dr. Patel's expression was compassionate. That's not a question medicine can fully answer. Alzheimer's doesn't create new personality traits, it often amplifies existing ones while eroding executive function and emotional regulation. But it's important to understand that she's not choosing to forget. She's not choosing any of this. I took my mother home and helped her settle in for the evening, then sat in my main house, staring at the walls until well past midnight. The next afternoon, I found her in the guest house looking through old photo albums I'd brought from storage, ones I hadn't seen in years. She had one open on her lap, and she was touching a photo of me at age 10 standing proudly beside my science fair project about solar energy. Her finger traced the outline of my younger face. "I had a daughter once who looked like this," she said softly, more to herself than to me. "She was so smart. Always building things, asking questions. I hope I told her that. I hope she knew." My throat closed. I knelt beside her chair, my hands shaking. "Mom, I'm Renee. I'm your daughter. That's me in the picture." She looked at me, her eyes confused, searching my face for something she couldn't quite find. Then for just a moment, clarity flickered across her features like sunlight through clouds. "Renee, when did you get so grown up?" Her hand reached for mine, gripping it with surprising strength. "I'm sorry. I forgot you were coming today. I forget so many things now." "It's okay, Mom." "Is it?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I feel like I'm losing myself. Like I'm disappearing piece by piece and I can't hold on." Then the clarity faded as quickly as it had come, and she looked around the room with renewed confusion. "Do you know where Samantha is? She's supposed to help me with dinner. We're having guests tonight." There were no guests. There was no dinner to prepare. There was just my mother disappearing into a disease that would eventually take everything: her memories, her personality, her ability to recognize her own daughters. I held her hand and wept for all of it. For the mother who'd hurt me when her mind was whole. For the mother who was vanishing now before we'd ever had the chance to heal what was broken. For the reality that some questions would never have answers, some wounds would never have the closure of acknowledgement. I couldn't punish her anymore. Alzheimer's already had. Caring for my mother became a strange, unexpected rhythm in my life. I hired a part-time aide to help during the day, but I found myself spending evenings in the guest house sitting with her while she looked through photo albums or watched old movies she could still follow. Some days she knew who I was. Other days, I was a kind stranger who resembled someone she used to know. I learned to meet her wherever she was, to stop correcting or reminding, to simply be present in whatever reality her fragmenting mind had constructed. I thought often about Samantha during those months, wondered how she was managing with Mark in federal custody awaiting trial. The news coverage had been relentless. Every detail of the extortion case dissected in public. Mark's mugshot circulated endlessly speculation about how long he'd serve. But Samantha had gone silent, her social media dormant, no public statements or tearful videos. She'd simply vanished from the narrative she'd once occupied so prominently. I learned the truth of her situation 9 months after the wedding, not from Samantha herself, but from my father during one of his awkward visits to check on my mother. We stood in my kitchen while my mother napped in the guest house, and he told me about Samantha's complete unraveling with the exhausted resignation of someone who'd watched it happen in real time, but had no power to stop it. The wedding had cost nearly $200,000, funded by the trust money that was now being clawed back through May's lawsuit. Every vendor had required non-refundable deposits: the venue, the caterer, the photographer, the dress that had cost more than most people's cars. Samantha and Mark had put the remaining expenses on credit cards, assuming they'd pay it off gradually. Now Samantha was left with $80,000 in debt and no income. Mark's legal fees had drained what little savings they'd had before the FBI froze their joint accounts as part of the investigation. Samantha's art career, which had always been more aspiration than actual income, provided nothing. The galleries that had occasionally shown her work wanted nothing to do with the viral villain from the wedding video. Her commissioned pieces dried up. Her part-time teaching position at a community art center quietly didn't renew her contract. She'd been forced to move from the trendy loft in Wicker Park to a studio apartment in a neighborhood where sirens punctuated the night and the building elevator was perpetually broken. Her friends all disappeared, my father said, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers. Those Instagram people she was always having brunch with, the ones who came to the wedding in designer dresses. They all vanished the moment she couldn't afford their lifestyle anymore. She's completely alone. I felt a complicated knot of emotion, satisfaction that she was facing consequences, but also something uncomfortably close to pity. What about you? Are you helping her? He shook his head. I offered. She won't take my money. Says she doesn't want anything from me after what I did to you. He looked up at me, then his eyes red-rimmed. She's been visiting your mother every week. Did you know that? Bringing groceries, sitting with her. The aide told me. I hadn't known. The aide had mentioned the younger daughter stopping by, but I'd been so focused on my own caregiving that I hadn't asked for details or adjusted my schedule to overlap with Samantha's visits. We'd been carefully avoiding each other, orbiting around our mother like planets that couldn't occupy the same space. The next week, I deliberately came to the guest house during a time I knew Samantha would be there. I found them sitting together at the small dining table, working on a simple jigsaw puzzle, a landscape of flowers that my mother kept trying to force wrong pieces into place. Samantha was guiding her hands, gently redirecting, without correcting, speaking in a soft voice I'd never heard her use before. I stood in the doorway, watching them, and Samantha looked up, startled. She'd lost weight. Her face gaunt, her clothes hanging loose. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She looked nothing like the glowing bride from 9 months ago, or the cruel, confident woman who'd called me trash in that hallway. "I was just leaving," she said quickly, standing up and gathering her things, a canvas bag from the library with books my mother would forget. She'd read a container of homemade soup, because our mother often forgot to eat. "You don't have to go," I said, surprising us both. But she was already moving toward the door, and I didn't stop her. After she left, my mother looked at me with confused eyes and asked, "Where did that nice girl go?" "She reminds me of someone." 2 days later, a letter arrived at my office. Not an email or a text, but actual handwritten pages on drugstore stationery delivered by courier. My assistant Jennifer brought it to me with a curious expression, and I opened it alone in my office with my door closed. The handwriting was Samantha's, recognizable from years of birthday cards, and the occasional note, but less careful than before, the letters sometimes shaky, as if her hand had trembled while writing. "Renee," it began. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I need you to know some things, and I need to say them without an audience for once in my life. You were right about Mark. You were right about me. You were right about everything." The letter continued for 3 pages, raw and unpolished, and more honest than anything Samantha had ever said to me. She wrote about growing up in our house where love felt like a competition, where she'd learned that attention was the only currency that mattered. She wrote about watching me leave for MIT and feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. Relieved she'd finally won the competition, terrified she'd never be as capable or independent. She wrote about Mark pursuing her, deliberately asking questions about me that she'd answered because it felt good to be the one with information someone wanted. "I didn't know he was using me to steal from you," she wrote. "I swear I didn't understand that until much later. But I also didn't ask questions I should have asked because some part of me liked the idea of him needing something from me that connected to you. That's sick, I know. I've spent 9 months in therapy unpacking how sick it is. I spent my whole life being jealous of you because you were everything I wasn't. Smart, capable, self-sufficient. I was cruel because I was terrified of being invisible, of being nothing, without someone watching and applauding." The final paragraph made my throat tight. "I'm not asking you to fix this or help me or forgive me. I'm not even sure I've forgiven myself. I'm just asking you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. I see what our family did to both of us. And I'm so sorry. I'm learning what it means to care for someone without an audience, sitting with Mom through her bad days. It's the first real thing I've ever done. Maybe the only real thing. I hope someday you can look at me and see something other than the worst version of myself. But if you can't, I understand. Love, Samantha." I read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in my desk drawer. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't call or text or show up at her studio apartment. But I kept the letter, and some part of me softened just slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. Maybe monsters could learn. Or maybe this was just another performance. I didn't know yet. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and coffee, a mixture of exhaustion and truth. I had been in that building before for business meetings, zoning disputes, contract mediations, but this time it was different. This time the case was personal, even though I tried to convince myself it wasn't. The seal above the judge's bench read, "United States District Court," and I remember thinking how small the words looked compared to the weight they carried. Mark Dalton sat at the defense table in a gray suit, his posture too casual for a man whose life was unraveling. I took my seat in this gallery behind the prosecution, determined to stay composed. For 12 months since the wedding, I had rebuilt my business, watched my mother decline, and seen Samantha stumble through the wreckage of her own choices. Now everything had led here, the trial that would expose what he'd done, not just to me, but to everyone who believed in him. The prosecutor began with a steady voice outlining the charges: extortion, fraud, and blackmail. Each word felt like a hammer striking the coffin of the man who once smiled at me and called me boss. They presented the evidence in meticulous order: recorded conversations, financial transactions, copies of threatening emails. I watched as Mark's own voice echoed through the speakers, low and confident, demanding money from my father in exchange for silence. "You don't want this to go public, do you?" he'd said. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of my father's shame on tape. I stole a glance at him in the witness section. He looked smaller than I remembered, his hands trembling, but when he was called to the stand, something in him steadied. For the first time in my life, I saw my father face the truth head-on. He admitted that Mark had manipulated him for years, using fear and guilt to control him. He spoke about the night Mark threatened to leak family financial records unless he transferred funds into a shell company. When he finished, there were tears in his eyes. "I was weak," he said softly, "but I'm not afraid anymore." Those words, more than any verdict, began to heal something in me I hadn't realized was still broken. Mark's defense attorney tried his best to paint him as a desperate man driven by love and panic. He was under immense pressure, the lawyer insisted. He acted out of fear of losing his family, not malice. The jury didn't buy it. They watched Mark like he was a spectacle they'd already seen too many times, a man who thought charm could outtalk justice. I recognized that arrogance. It was the same look he wore at the wedding when everything still belonged to him. During recess, reporters whispered near the back rows, some of them recognizing me from old photos. "That's the sister," I heard one say. "The CEO from the viral video." I kept my gaze forward. I wasn't here for fame or vindication. I just wanted the truth to be permanent this time, recorded in ink instead of whispers. On the fourth day, the prosecution announced a surprise witness. The defense objected, but the judge allowed it. A woman walked to the stand, elegant but visibly nervous, her accent faintly French-Canadian. "My name is Claire Rousseau," she said. My heart sank. The name meant nothing to me then, but what followed would change everything. Claire testified that she had been engaged to Mark 2 years before he married Samantha. He had proposed, they had booked a venue in Montreal, even paid deposits together. Then he borrowed $200,000 from her for a business investment that never existed. When she tried to contact him about repayment, he vanished, blocked her number, changed his address. 6 months later, she saw his wedding photos, Mark smiling beside my sister in a vineyard dress worth more than most people's homes. The prosecutor guided her gently. "Did he ever mention the Steele family to you?" Claire nodded. "Yes. He said Samantha's family had better connections. He said it wasn't personal." She handed over a printed text message. The courtroom gasped. It wasn't just fraud, it was a pattern of manipulation that spanned continents. The evidence, bank transfers, photos, emails, was irrefutable. Samantha, sitting a few rows behind me, looked pale, like her breath had been pulled from her lungs. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. The next morning, Samantha did something I never expected. She approached the prosecutor's table during recess and asked to testify. She wasn't required to. As Mark's wife, she could have claimed spousal privilege. Instead, she waived it. When she walked to the stand, the room buzzed. Even the judge looked surprised. Her voice shook at first, but grew steadier as she spoke. "Mark pursued me after learning my sister was a CEO," she said. "He asked about her contracts, her clients, our family finances. I thought he was just curious." The prosecutor let her continue. "He told me to seat her by the hallway at the wedding. He said it would be funny." She paused, wiping her eyes. "I went along with it because I was jealous. I thought humiliating her would make me feel bigger, but I didn't know he was using me to get to her. I didn't know he was using me for everything." The courtroom was silent. The reporter beside me stopped typing. For once, Samantha wasn't performing. She was confessing. When she stepped down, I didn't look away. She passed by my seat, eyes swollen, and for a fleeting moment our gazes met. There was no hatred there anymore, just recognition. 2 women finally seeing the man who had stood between them crumble into nothing. The trial dragged on for 3 weeks. Witness after witness confirmed what we already knew: Mark Dalton was a con artist who had weaponized charm and desperation. The jury took only 4 hours to deliberate. When they returned, the foreman stood voice clear. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." Mark didn't flinch. He stared straight ahead as the judge read the sentence: 5 years in federal prison, restitution to Claire Rousseau and Thomas Steele, forfeiture of assets. Justice, at least in its legal form, was done. Outside cameras flashed reporters, shouted questions. I ignored them all. Samantha left alone, no entourage, no tears for the cameras. Just silence. My father walked beside me, slower now, but somehow lighter. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. It wasn't enough to erase everything, but it was something. The sky outside the courthouse was gray, the kind of gray that promises rain but delivers calm instead. For the first time in months, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated either, just empty in a way that was almost peaceful. Mark was sentenced. My family was shattered. And I felt nothing, not victory, not relief, just tired. The day after the sentencing, I drove out to my mother's house to help her sort through old boxes. The doctors said her Alzheimer's had reached the moderate stage. She still knew my name most days, but sometimes she called me by hers or by her sister's. There was something haunting in that, like memory had turned into a carousel, and she could no longer control which horse she was riding. The house smelled the same as always, lavender and old paper, and though I hadn't lived there in nearly 2 decades, it felt like walking through a preserved museum of who we used to be. My father was gone, living quietly in a rented apartment, and my mother was moving to assisted living. That left me to pack up the remnants of our family history, one fragile memory at a time. I was in my grandfather's old study when I found it, an envelope tucked inside a box of faded photographs addressed in handwriting I knew instantly. For Renee, it said dated 13 years ago. My throat tightened. He had died that same spring. The paper inside was yellowed, but his penmanship was still steady. I sat down at his desk, the same oak one I used to sit under as a little girl, and began to read. Dear Renee, if you're reading this, then my plan worked and you've held your family accountable. Good. They needed to learn. But now I need you to learn something harder. Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for you. If you hold on to anger, even justified anger, they still control you. They still win. Let it go, sweetheart. Not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. Build your life. Love openly. And know that you were always, always enough. I must have read those words a dozen times before I realized my hands were shaking. It felt like he'd written them yesterday, knowing exactly where I'd end up. He had been the only one who saw through the chaos back then, the only person who told me I was destined for more than survival. And here he was again, reaching across time to tell me that survival wasn't the finish line. I folded the letter back carefully and set it on the desk, my heart heavy with the realization that I had spent so long proving everyone wrong that I'd forgotten how to feel right within myself. For the next few hours, I sat there in that study, surrounded by the ghosts of our family books. He'd underlined old project sketches he and I used to draw together, my childhood report cards filed neatly in a drawer. Through the window, the garden was overgrown, but I could still see the outline of the path he'd built with his own hands. I thought about the past 18 months, Samantha bankrupt and humbled Mark behind bars. My father separated and diminished my mother, fading like a photograph left in the sun. And me, Renee Steele, CEO, the woman who won. Yet somehow I felt like I was standing in ashes. Every victory had come with a cost. Every act of revenge had been a transaction, not a triumph. I had proven my strength, but I hadn't healed the part of me that still flinched at being told to sit in the hallway. Dr. Chen's voice echoed in my mind from a session weeks earlier. You can't punish your way to peace. I had brushed it off then, but now it landed like a quiet truth. I had spent years believing justice would heal me, but justice had been external. Healing had to come from somewhere deeper, somewhere private. It wasn't about courtrooms or headlines. It was about the silence I faced every night when I went home alone and realized I didn't know what joy looked like without struggle. The following weeks became a series of small reckonings. I called my attorney and told him to withdraw the civil lawsuit against my parents. They were broke and broken. What more could I possibly take? Money wouldn't buy back what we'd all lost. He protested, saying it was my right to collect damages, but I said I'm done collecting. I meant it in every way possible. Then I picked up the phone and called Samantha. It was the first time we'd spoken without lawyers or cameras in 15 years. Her voice was hesitant, like she was waiting for a trap. I told her I don't know if we'll ever be sisters again, but I'm done being your enemy. There was a long pause, and then she said, I think that's all I ever wanted. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something fragile and real. Visiting my mother at the care facility was harder. Some days she recognized me instantly. Other days she called me the kind lady with the books. I brought photo albums, wedding pictures, birthdays, even the old family vacation at Cannon Beach. I read aloud while she flipped pages she no longer remembered posing for. Sometimes she'd smile and say, "She looks happy," pointing to a younger version of herself. I'd answer, "She was." On good days, she'd look at me and say, "You have his eyes," meaning my grandfather. I'd nod, pretending not to cry. It was strange how caring for her now felt less like obligation and more like quiet redemption. The anger that had defined me for so long began to soften, not through effort, but through exhaustion. I doubled my therapy sessions from once a month to twice a week. Dr. Chen encouraged me to stop focusing on the wreckage and start building something new. What would creation look like instead of correction? She asked. The question lingered until one morning, while reviewing architectural blueprints at my firm, I found my answer. A community center for women rebuilding their lives after family estrangement, education, counseling, job support. A place for second chances. I spent weeks sketching designs, pulling old notes from projects I'd shelved years ago. It felt different this time. Not about power, not about control, just about building something that might outlast the pain that created it. As winter turned to spring, I felt lighter, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the act of letting go. Maybe it was the letter still sitting on my nightstand, reminding me that love could survive even the worst years. One evening after visiting my mother, I returned home and sat by the fireplace. The flames danced softly, and I thought about how long I'd carried my anger like kindling, feeding it to stay warm in a world that had once been so cold. I realized I didn't need it anymore. My grandfather had been right. Holding on to the fire hadn't kept me warm, it had just burned my hands. The phone rang at 2 a.m., cutting through the quiet like a blade. For a moment I thought it was a wrong number. No one good ever calls at that hour. When I answered, a calm but urgent voice identified herself as a nurse from St. Luke's Regional Hospital. She said my name carefully, as if gauging how it might land. "Ms. Steele, your sister Samantha Dalton has been in an accident. You're listed as her emergency contact." For a few seconds I couldn't process what she meant. Samantha had made me her emergency contact when... Why, the nurse explained that she had swerved to avoid a deer on a rural road. Her car flipped and she was in the ICU with internal injuries and a concussion. "She's stable, but she's been asking for you," she added. That was what did it, the word asking. For me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, the silence pressing against my chest. Then I found myself grabbing my keys. I didn't know if I was going out of obligation, curiosity, or some old reflex that still recognized her as my sister. Maybe all three. The drive through the night felt endless. The roads were empty except for the occasional truck, and the headlights carved tunnels through the fog. My mind kept circling the same question: why me? After everything, the humiliation, the betrayal, the lawsuits, the distance, why had she chosen my name to call? The logical part of me whispered that it was an administrative oversight, a leftover contact she'd never updated. But another part, softer and quieter, hoped that maybe it wasn't. Maybe somewhere beneath all the wreckage, she still thought of me as family. When I reached the hospital, the air smelled like antiseptic and coffee. The nurse at the front desk recognized me from the call and guided me down a long hallway that buzzed faintly with fluorescent light. She explained that Samantha had been in and out of consciousness but kept mumbling my name. I thanked her and hesitated at the ICU door. Behind that curtain of machinery and tubing was the person who had once been my mirror and my rival, my childhood shadow and my lifelong wound. I wasn't sure which version of her I would find. The first thing I noticed was how small she looked. Samantha had always carried herself like the center of every room, her presence sharp and deliberate. But here, under the harsh hospital light, she looked fragile, her face pale, her hair matted against the pillow. She was asleep at first, or maybe just unconscious, her breaths uneven but steady. I sat in the corner, unsure if I should speak, and stared at the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. For the first time in years, there was no performance between us, no makeup, no audience, no pretense. Just two sisters in a room full of ghosts. A soft groan broke the quiet. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then searching. When she saw me, something like relief crossed her face. "You came?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. I nodded, not trusting my own words. She tried to smile, but winced instead. "I thought if I was good enough, pretty enough, special enough, they'd love me the way I wanted," she said slowly, the medication making her voice slur. "But it was never enough. And you were enough just by existing. Smart, capable, self-sufficient. I hated you for that." I stayed quiet. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound smaller than what she was confessing. Tears pooled at the corners of her eyes. "I helped Mark steal your designs," she said, suddenly the words breaking through a sob. "He told me it was just industry research, and I believed him because I wanted to. But deep down, I knew. I knew, and I did it anyway because I wanted you to fail. I wanted you to hurt like I hurt." She looked away ashamed. "I don't want your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the truth before it's too late." For a long time, I just watched her. I could have asked why or demanded details or even reminded her how much it had cost me. But none of that seemed to matter. The damage was done, and the punishment had already been life itself. I stood up and moved closer, pulling a chair to her bedside. Her hand looked small against the white sheet and IV taped across the back. "I didn't say I forgive you. I wasn't there yet. Instead, I said, we were both just kids trying to survive a house that didn't have enough love to go around." Her eyes flicked toward me, uncertain, and I continued. "You're right. I was different. But that didn't mean I didn't hurt too." The words felt foreign in my mouth, but honest. "I spent so long being angry at you that I forgot we were both just wounded." I reached for her hand, gently avoiding the needle. She let me. The contact felt fragile, like holding something that could break if either of us breathed too hard. We sat like that for what felt like hours, the machines humming a rhythm neither of us could escape. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic reconciliations. Just silence and tears shared and unspoken. Healing, I realized, didn't come with music or applause. It came in the quiet, messy spaces where pain and grace touched without asking permission. At some point, the nurse came in to check her vitals and smiled faintly when she saw us. "She's lucky to have you here," she whispered. I didn't correct her. Lucky wasn't the right word, but maybe it was close enough. When the nurse left, Samantha's breathing evened out, her body relaxing into sleep. I stayed where I was, too afraid that if I moved, something between us might disappear again. The clock ticked softly above the door. I thought of all the nights I had stayed awake, resenting her, the hours spent replaying old wounds. None of it seemed important anymore. When the first light of morning began to seep through the blinds, I realized I had dozed off in the chair. My neck ached. My legs were stiff, but for once I didn't mind the discomfort. I heard a faint voice. "Renee." Samantha was awake again, her eyes clearer now. "You stayed?" she asked, disbelief and confusion mingling in her tone. I folded the magazine in my lap, the one I had picked up during the night to keep my hands busy. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I stayed." She blinked, tears gathering again. "Why?" she whispered. I met her gaze and gave the only answer that made sense. "Because you're still my sister, even when I didn't want you to be." Her lip trembled and she nodded, turning her face toward the window where sunlight cut across the room. For the first time in years, we didn't feel like enemies orbiting the same broken family. We just felt like sisters, fragile and unfinished, sitting in the middle of something that might someday become peace. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the first step towards something that looked like family. 2 years after the wedding that changed everything, I stood in front of a ballroom filled with strangers, friends, reporters, and women whose faces I recognized from the stories they'd written to me. The chandeliers above cast warm light across polished tables, and for a moment I remembered another room, another event where I had been seated beside a trash bin. It felt like a lifetime ago. Tonight was different. Tonight every table had a place for someone who once believed they didn't belong anywhere. The Steel Heart Foundation was officially launching, and despite all the media, all the speeches, all the noise, it felt deeply, quietly personal. When I first dreamed of creating the foundation, I wanted it to be more than charity. I wanted it to be infrastructure for second chances, career counseling for women rebuilding after estrangement therapy, funding for survivors of abuse, legal aid for those disinherited or silenced. The tagline we'd printed on every invitation read, "From isolation to empowerment." I hadn't realized until now how much that line applied to me too. Standing at the edge of the stage, I could see faces that mirrored my own journey, women who had lost families, homes, dignity, and somehow found the will to start again. The board of directors sat near the front, Eleanor Vance, who had fought to keep her home after her husband left her for someone half her age, David Chen, whose calm intelligence had guided the foundation through its legal birth, and Mae Thompson, elegant in a navy dress, her silver hair shining under the lights. Lila, now 18 and freshly accepted to MIT on a full scholarship, waited backstage with a speech folded neatly in her hand. I caught her eye and smiled. She nodded the confident kind of nod that only comes from surviving what others think should have broken you. The evening unfolded like a slow exhale. The orchestra played something hopeful. Champagne glasses clinked and the low murmur of conversation filled the air. When it was my turn to speak, the room quieted. I looked out over the audience and saw expectation, but also something deeper, recognition. They didn't see a CEO tonight. They saw a woman who had crawled out of the rubble of her own story and decided to build something with it. 2 years ago, I was the woman sitting by the trash at someone else's table. Tonight, I get to welcome you to mine. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, soft but knowing. The Steel Heart Foundation was born from one question. What happens to the people who get left out? The daughters, the sisters, the mothers who are told they don't belong or who walk away because staying hurts too much. This isn't a pity project. It's an investment in rebuilding lives, not perfectly but powerfully. Lila took the stage after me, her voice steady and clear. She told her story, the abandonment, the loneliness, the mentor who gave her her first internship. Ms. Steele believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, she said. She told me that broken things aren't worthless. They're proof that we've survived something. When she finished, the room rose to its feet. I felt my eyes sting, not from pride exactly, but from recognition. The girl I had once been was standing in front of me in another body, another time rewriting our shared ending. After Lila stepped down, I took the microphone again for what I thought would be the final part of the evening. Instead, it became something else entirely. Before we close, I said, there's someone here I need to tell you about. I turned toward May, who sat near the stage, smiling her small secret smile. Many of you know May as the woman who handed me a glass of champagne when I was sitting beside a trash can at my sister's wedding. What you don't know is that Mae Thompson was one of the first Black female civil rights attorneys in Chicago. For 40 years, she fought housing discrimination, defended women in custody battles, and changed lives long before hashtags existed to make it fashionable. A murmur swept through the crowd. I saw a few journalists lower their cameras, stunned. She retired at 65, I continued, and got bored. So she started working part-time at event venues because she loved people. She was also my grandfather's closest friend, and as I only recently learned, the secret architect of his will. May's eyes widened at that last part, and then she laughed. The audience joined in. She made sure that the right lessons reached me even when my family didn't. And tonight I'm proud to tell you that May Thompson is our Foundation's Chair Emeritus. The entire room rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous. May stood blushing and waved off the attention with the same humility that had made her powerful all along. I thought of my grandfather's letter, of the words he'd written about forgiveness and peace, and how May had carried those lessons forward without ever preaching them. She had simply lived them. When the applause faded, I turned back to the microphone. "I want to end tonight by telling you a story," I said. 2 years ago, I went to my sister's wedding. I found my seat in the hallway next to the trash. Someone told me I deserved to sit there. But then May walked by, handed me a glass of champagne, and said, "You deserve better, honey." I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of everything that came after. The audience was silent now, not from pity, but from understanding. I gestured toward the screen behind me where the Foundation's logo appeared, a simple wooden table with many chairs around it. Beneath it, the tagline read, "Build your own table. If they sit you by the trash," I said, smiling. "Build your own table and make sure it's big enough for everyone who's been left out." The laughter came first, then the tears. Some people stood and clapped. Others simply nodded, holding hands with the women beside them. The moment didn't feel like victory. It felt like belonging. After the speeches ended, people crowded around May for photos, and Lila disappeared into a group of donors who wanted to meet her. I stood by the edge of the stage, letting the hum of conversation wash over me. For once, it wasn't about me, it was about what could come next. My phone buzzed in my clutch. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "I'm proud of you." The name at the top read Samantha. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I saved the message quietly, the way you might press a fragile flower between pages to preserve it. As the night wound down, I looked around at the room full of people who had once been invisible. And I felt something I hadn't in years, peace not as an idea, but as a pulse, steady and warm. I'd started at a trash table. Now I was building something that couldn't be thrown away. 2 weeks after the Foundation Gala, I did something that felt both absurd and necessary. I wrote 2 invitations by hand. Just a few words on thick paper, no preamble, no signature flourish. Let's try. One went to Samantha's small apartment on the east side of town, the other to my father's new address, a modest place above a bakery where he'd been living quietly since the separation. I didn't know if either of them would come. I didn't even know if I wanted them to. But the silence between us had grown too loud. After years of anger exposure and unhealed wounds, I wanted to see what happened when we stopped speaking through lawyers, doctors, or the ghosts of who we used to be. The dinner wasn't elaborate. I cooked roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans because they were simple and safe. The table was set for 3 candles lit, but not too bright. My house had seen journalists, donors, architects, and board members walk through its doors, but never my family, not since everything fell apart. The walls held the echo of their absence, and as I adjusted the silverware, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Some wounds don't close cleanly. They just learn to live open. Samantha arrived first 20 minutes early, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. "They're from the farmer's market," she said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "It's all I could afford." I took them from her and found a vase. "They're perfect," I said, and meant it. Her eyes flicked around the room as if cataloging every object she didn't remember. She looked older, thinner, her face softer somehow, like the sharp edges had finally worn down. My father came a few minutes later carrying a homemade peach pie. The smell was unexpected and sweet. "I baked it myself," he said a little too quickly. "Been trying new things." His voice was hesitant but genuine. He looked smaller too, the kind of small that comes from remorse more than age. I told him it smelled wonderful, and for a second his eyes brightened. Dinner started with the usual small-talk safe topics that felt like neutral ground. Weather work, neighborhood gossip. Samantha complimented the house, and I thanked her without mentioning that she used to mock my minimalist taste. My father asked about the foundation, and I gave short, polite answers, careful not to sound like I was lecturing. Every sentence felt like stepping over glass, and the silences between them were sharp. But there was a strange comfort in the awkwardness. It was at least real. Halfway through the meal, my father set down his fork and sighed. "I don't know how to do this," he said. His voice cracked and his hands trembled slightly. "I don't know how to be your father after being such a terrible one." The room stilled. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You don't need to be perfect," I said quietly. "You just need to be honest." He nodded, his eyes wet. "I thought keeping peace meant keeping quiet," he said. But all it did was make the noise louder. Samantha leaned forward, elbows on the table, and whispered, "I'm learning that too. Being perfect was killing me." The honesty in her voice was fragile, but it filled the space like oxygen. We began to talk not about the scandals or betrayals, but about the years before all of it. I told them about the first year I lived alone, working double shifts to pay rent, eating instant noodles for dinner, crying in bathrooms during job interviews because I didn't know how to be strong yet. Samantha confessed how being the favorite felt like a cage. Every compliment was a chain, she said. I couldn't fail without feeling like I was breaking them. Our father listened, face pale but intent. When it was his turn, he said, "My father never told me he loved me. Not once. I thought if I just provided it would be enough. But I see now it wasn't. It never was." For a while, none of us spoke. The weight of 3 generations hung in the air the way patterns of pain do when they're finally named. I realized sitting there that our family's greatest curse wasn't cruelty, it was silence. Every generation mistook withholding for strength, and all it did was leave us strangers who shared blood, but not warmth. Maybe breaking the pattern wasn't about grand apologies or sweeping forgiveness. Maybe it was just about staying in the room long enough to speak. After dinner, we cleared the table together. It was clumsy choreography, passing plates, bumping shoulders, small laughter when Samantha nearly dropped a glass. My father washed while I dried, and for a fleeting second it felt almost ordinary. Samantha teased him about his pie crust edges, and he groaned in mock protest. I caught myself smiling. When the dishes were done, we moved to the living room. I showed them photos of Lila's latest architecture project on my tablet, her design for a sustainable shelter for women in transition. Samantha asked questions genuinely curious, and my father said it reminded him of my grandfather's old workshop. We talked about small things, the kind of things families talk about when they're trying to rebuild without stirring up ghosts. As the night wore on, the tension began to fade, replaced by a fragile rhythm. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was movement. My father stood and said, "Maybe we could do this again sometime." Samantha nodded immediately, eyes bright. "Yeah, I'd like that." I didn't hesitate. "Me too," I said. And I meant it. When they left, I walked them both to the door. Samantha hugged me lightly, uncertain at first, then tighter like someone relearning the motion. My father squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you for letting me try." I watched as they got into their separate cars, headlights casting long lines down the street before disappearing into the night. Standing on the porch, I felt the cool air brush against my face. The house behind me was quiet again, but not empty. For the first time in 20 years, it held something fragile but a live possibility. Healing, I realized, didn't come in applause or ceremonies. It came in awkward dinners, trembling voices, and small choices repeated until they started to matter. It wasn't certainty, but it was something close enough. It was hope. Peace didn't look like a celebration. It looked like 3 broken people choosing to keep showing up. 3 years can change everything and nothing at the same time. The morning of Lila's wedding dawned clear and golden sunlight spilling across the city like a quiet blessing. I stood by my bedroom window in a flowing blue dress I had chosen for its softness rather than its power, and for once I didn't feel the need to armor myself. My hair was looser than I usually wore at my makeup light. When I caught my reflection, I saw someone I almost recognized, the version of me that had been waiting beneath all the anger, the ambition, the need to prove. I slipped on the silver bracelet May had given me before she retired, her words echoing, "You built something good. Now, let it live." The venue was an urban garden tucked between two restored warehouses, all glass and ivy and light. Lila had chosen it because she said it felt like rebirth beauty grown out of steel. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I arrived early, wanting to see her before the guests filled the space. She was radiant, her dress simple and elegant, her smile trembling with the kind of joy that doesn't need to be perfect. "You really didn't have to help pay for all this," she said when she saw me. I took her hands and replied, "Let someone love you the way I wish someone had loved me." She started crying, which of course made me cry too. David greeted me outside the ceremony area with a warm hug. He looked happy, settled in a way I hadn't seen before. His partner James stood beside him, kind-eyed and gracious, and when he extended his hand, I took it easily. The past few years had made us something like a family, non-traditional maybe, but no less real. As guests arrived, laughter and camera shutters filled the air, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like an outsider at a celebration. Everyone belonged here, including me. When the ceremony began, I found my seat at the front row center. A small card lay on the chair, handwritten in Lila's elegant scrawl. "For the woman who taught me I was enough." My throat closed as I read it. Around me the garden hummed with life, the sound of leaves shifting in the wind, soft music playing somewhere behind us, the murmur of anticipation. I thought about the first wedding I had attended 3 years earlier, about the hallway, the trash, the humiliation that had carved a scar I thought would never fade. And yet here I was, front and center, not because of status or pity, but because of love freely given. As Lila and her partner exchanged vows, I felt a stillness I hadn't known in years. Her voice was steady when she said, "I promise to love you, even when it's hard." The words pierced something tender inside me. That's what I had been learning too, not about romance, but about family, about myself, about how love isn't proof of worth, but a choice made over and over, even when it's difficult. Every version of me, the invisible daughter, the bitter sister, the woman clawing her way through shame and fire, sat together quietly, finally at peace. None of them were in control anymore. They didn't need to be. The reception was held under strings of golden lights that swayed in the evening breeze. Tables overflowed with food and laughter. When Lila approached and asked if I would give a toast, I hesitated, my chest tightening. I had spoken in boardrooms, on stages, in courtrooms, but this was different. This was sacred in its own way. When I stood, the room hushed and every face turned toward me. Samantha was there, seated a few rows back, invited by Lila because she's your sister and she's trying. Our eyes met briefly, not with pain this time, but with understanding. 3 years ago, I sat at a wedding where I was told I belonged with the trash. A ripple of soft laughter passed through the crowd. I won't lie, it broke something in me, but it also freed me. Because I learned that when people try to throw you away, you have 2 choices: believe them or build your own table. My voice trembled slightly, but I didn't stop. I chose the second option. And Lila. I turned to her, smiling through tears. "You've taught me that the table I build doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be mine. And big enough for the people who choose to love me back." For a moment, no one moved. Then the applause began, gentle at first, then swelling into something that filled the room like light. Lila wiped her eyes. David nodded at me, proud and quiet. And in the back, I saw Samantha's hands come together, clapping slowly, sincerely. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, it was acknowledgement. And maybe that was even better. Later, when the music softened and the crowd began to thin, I stood near the garden's edge watching Lila dance with her new spouse under the twinkle of lights. Samantha approached, hesitant but smiling. We stood side by side in silence for a while, watching the movement, the laughter, the ease that once seemed impossible. "Thank you for inviting me," she said finally. I turned to her and said, Thank you for coming. It wasn't a movie moment. It didn't need to be. It was real, and that was enough. On the drive home, the city lights blurred through the windshield like falling stars. I thought about the girl who had sat by the trash, about the woman who built a table from the ruins, and about the peace that had finally settled between them. At a red light, I whispered softly to her and to myself. We made it. Not the way we thought. But we made it. When I got home, I slept deeper than I had in years. Unburdened, unguarded, whole. That day, I didn't just win. I healed. And that was my real revenge. Renee Steele's story may have ended, but its echo lives on in everyone who's ever been seated at life's hallway table. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside, remember, sometimes the moments that break you are the very ones that build your strength. I'd love to hear what this journey meant to you. What would you have done if you were Renee? Could you forgive, or would you walk away? Did her story change how you think about self-worth, family, or the way we learn to love ourselves again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. And if you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next tale of resilience, redemption, and quiet revenge. Thank you for staying until the end, because the next story might just be yours.